She had $11 to her name and a husband's grave 6 weeks cold when Alara Whitlock fell to her knees on a Wyoming roadside, stuffing shriveled berries into her mouth like a starving animal. A stranger on horseback stopped, looked down at her with eyes that had buried someone too, and asked the only question that mattered. "Can you cook for two?" She said yes before she even understood what she was agreeing to, and that single word would change everything. If you're watching this story right now, hit like, drop a comment with your city, and stay with me to the very end. The wind came down off the bighorns that morning, carrying the smell of frost and dead grass, and Alara Whitlock knelt in the ditch beside the Cheyenne Road with her skirt soaked through at the knees, picking at a scraggly chokecherry bush like it owed her something. The berries were mostly gone to rot, puckered and bitter, the kind a person only ate when there was nothing else, and she knew that because she'd eaten plenty of them in the last 2 weeks. She popped one into her mouth anyway and chewed slow, trying to make it last, trying to pretend it was something other than what it was. Her stomach made a sound like a door hinge that hadn't seen oil in a year. "Quiet," she muttered to it, like it might listen. It didn't. She'd been a Whitlock for 4 years, a Carroll before that, and somewhere in between she'd gone from a girl who ate 3 meals a day without thinking about it to a woman counting wild berries like they were coins. Thomas had been a decent man mostly, but decent men could still leave a mess behind them, and the mess Thomas Whitlock left was the kind that swallowed a house whole: gambling debts. A loan against the land she didn't even know existed until the bank man showed up with papers and a flat, apologetic mouth. Cattle sold off before she understood they were being sold. By the time the fever took Thomas in February, there wasn't much left to bury him with, let alone keep her fed through a Wyoming spring that didn't care one way or another whether she lived through it. She'd sold the bed, sold her mother's silver, what little there was of it, sold the good boots and kept the bad ones, because at 26 years old, dignity turned out to be a thing you could ration same as flour, and she was rationing hers down to the last spoonful. A horse's hooves came up slow behind her on the road, and Alara's spine went straight as a fence post. She didn't turn around right away. She'd learned that much in 6 weeks of walking roads alone. You didn't show a stranger your face full of fear, even when the fear was honest. "Ma'am." The voice was low and rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel, not unkind exactly, just worn down to its essentials. She turned her head. The man on the horse was maybe 10 years older than her, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from work and not from food, with a face that had spent too many years squinting into weather. His hat brim was cracked. His coat had a tear at the elbow somebody had stitched with the wrong color thread. He sat his horse like a man who'd rather be anywhere else than talking to a stranger on a roadside, but here he was anyway. "Morning," Alara said, and she heard how thin her own voice sounded, like paper. He didn't say good morning back. He just looked at her, at the berries staining her fingers purple, at the hollows under her eyes, at the dress that had been let out twice and taken in 3 times and still hung wrong on her now. And something moved behind his eyes that wasn't pity. Pity she could have stood up against. This was something closer to recognition. "You eating berries off a dead bush?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Alara said, because there wasn't any sense lying about something he could see plain as day. "Folks around here?" "No, sir." "Husband?" "Dead." She said it flat, the way you say a thing you've had to say enough times that it stops cutting fresh and just leaves a dull ache instead. 6 weeks this Tuesday. The horse shifted its weight, and the man's hand came down to settle it without him even looking, an old habit between man and animal. He was quiet a long moment, long enough that Alara started to wonder if he'd just ride on, the way most people did when a widow's troubles got too specific for comfort. Instead, he said, "Can you cook for two?" Alara blinked. Of all the questions she might have expected, "Where are you headed? Do you need money? Does anybody know you're out here?" That one hadn't crossed her mind at all. "I beg your pardon?" "Cook," he said again, like maybe she hadn't heard him the first time. "For 2 men, 3 some days, when the hands come up from the south pasture for dinner instead of taking it cold. You know how to cook, or are you just good at picking berries off a half-dead bush?" There was something in the way he said it, not cruel but not soft either, that made her want to laugh, which surprised her because she hadn't laughed in 6 weeks and didn't much feel like she had it in her anymore. "I can cook," she said. "I kept a house for 4 years. I can do more than cook, if it comes to that. It might. He looked at her a second longer, like he was doing arithmetic in his head and not liking every number he was finding. Name's Garrick Hale. I've got a ranch 11 miles north of here, off the Two Forks Road. Lost my cook in the fall. She went back east to live with her sister, and good for her, but it's left my hands eating burnt beans and worse, and it's left me doing it myself most nights, which nobody should have to suffer through, including me. He paused. I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I'm offering work. Bed in the kitchen loft, food, and $4 a week if you're worth your salt, which I won't know till I taste your cooking. Mom, this isn't some lunchapad. Alara stood up slow, her knees stiff from kneeling in the cold ditch, and brushed the worst of the dirt off her skirt, which didn't do much good since the dirt had soaked through to begin with. I'm worth my salt, she said. That's what they all say. Most of them are probably lying. I'm not. She lifted her chin, even though it cost her something to do it, even though her legs were shaking just a little from standing too fast on an empty stomach. Mr. Hale, I buried my husband 6 weeks ago, and I have walked from Laramie because I couldn't afford the stage, and I have eaten things off bushes that I wouldn't have fed a hog a year back. And I am telling you plain, I will cook better than any woman you've had in that kitchen, and I will do it because I have got nothing left to lose by trying. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted, just slightly, like a door easing open a crack. Well, he said, get up here then. 11 miles is a long walk on an empty stomach, and I'm not in the habit of making widows walk behind my horse like it's the Roman Empire. It took her a second to understand he meant for her to ride with him, and another second after that to feel the absurdity of it. A strange man on a strange road offering a strange woman a horse. But she was too hungry, and too tired, and too far past caring about what was proper to argue. She let him pull her up behind him, settling sideways on the horse's broad rump, with one hand gripping the back of the saddle, and they started north. They rode in silence for the better part of a mile before Alara spoke again. What happened to your wife? She felt him go still in front of her, just for a moment, the way a man goes still when somebody touches a bruise he thought had healed over. Who said I had one? You called your hands my hands, like a man used to running things alone, but you talk like somebody who used to have a kitchen with a woman in it, not just hired help. And you didn't ask if I had children, which most men would, before offering a stranger work and a bed under their roof. She paused. That's not an accusation, Mr. Hale, just an observation. He was quiet so long she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Margaret, he said finally, 3 years back, difficult birth. The baby didn't make it either. His voice didn't shake when he said it, but it went flatter, like something pressed down hard on it from the inside. House has been quiet since. I'm sorry. Folks say that a lot. Doesn't change much. He shifted the reins in his hands. I don't talk about it, as a rule. You'll learn that quick enough if you stay. I'm not in the habit of prying, Alara said. I only asked because a woman ought to know what kind of house she's walking into. Fair enough. A pause. What kind of house do you think you're walking into? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, turning it over before she answered. One that's forgotten what it's for, she said. A house is supposed to hold people together. Sounds like yours has just been holding you up, which isn't the same thing at all. He didn't answer that, but she felt something change in the set of his shoulders, like she'd said something that landed harder than she meant it to. The ranch came into view a little after midday, sitting low in a wide valley with hills rising gold and brown on either side, the grass gone dry and silver-tipped with the last of the cold. The house itself was a long, low timber building with a sagging porch and a chimney that needed pointing, and behind it stood a barn in better repair than the house, which told Alara plenty about where this man's priorities had settled in his grief. The animals fed, the house left to rot around him. There were 3 men working near the corral as they rode up, and they straightened when they saw the horse coming, exchanging looks Alara couldn't quite read from this distance. That's Otis, the older one, Garrick said, nodding toward a stooped man with gray stubble and a limp he favored on the left side. Been with me longest. Don't mind his mouth, he means well even when he doesn't sound it. The one beside him's Cal, younger, talks too much, but he works harder than he talks, which is saying something. Third one's Birdie. Don't ask why we call him that. Even he doesn't remember anymore. And what should I call you? Alara asked. In front of them, I mean. Garrick's fine. I'm not a man who stands much on ceremony. He brought the horse to a stop near the porch and swung down, then turned and offered her his hand to help her off, which she took, her legs unsteady the moment her feet hit solid ground after 11 miles of riding sideways on a horse's rump. Otis ambled over first, squinting at Alara like he was trying to work out a puzzle. This the new cook? This is Alara Whitlock, Garrick said. She'll be cooking, yes. Widow Whitlock, Otis said like he was testing the words. Heard about the Whitlock place going under. Bad business, that. It was, Alara agreed, because there wasn't any sense pretending otherwise, not with a man who already knew. Cal, the younger one, looked at her with open curiosity, the kind young men get when something unexpected happens in a place where not much ever does. You really gonna cook for us? Last cook we had, no offense to her, couldn't make beans without burning the bottom of the pot. I won't burn your beans, Alara said. That's what they all say, Cal said, grinning, and Alara realized with some surprise that it was the second time that exact phrase had been said to her in the space of 2 hours, and both times by men who hadn't tasted a bite of her cooking yet to know better. Get back to the fence line, Garrick said, not unkindly, but with enough weight that the 3 men moved without arguing. We'll talk supper later. Bertie, the quiet one, hadn't said a word the whole time, just looked at Alara with an expression she couldn't place. Not unfriendly, but careful, like a man who'd been disappointed by changes to his routine before and wasn't ready to trust a new one yet. When the hands had gone back to their work, Garrick led her up onto the porch, and the boards groaned under their weight in a way that told her the wood was older than it ought to be for a house this size. Kitchen's through there, he said, pushing open the front door. I'll show you the loft after. Fair warning, it's not been kept the way it should have been. That turned out to be an understatement. The kitchen Alara stepped into was a long room with a good iron stove against the far wall, a deep wash basin, and a table that could have sat 8 if it weren't half buried under dirty dishes, empty tins, and the kind of grease-stained mess that came from men who cooked because they had to, not because they cared. The floor hadn't been swept in what looked like weeks. A skillet sat on the stove with the remains of something burned black inside it, and the smell that hung in the air was thick and stale, old grease and wood smoke, and something underneath it that might have just been neglect. Alara stood in the doorway and looked at it all, and where most people might have seen ruin, she felt something else entirely, a kind of recognition, almost a relief, because a mess this thorough meant there was real work to be done, and real work was something she understood. Real work didn't ask questions about her past or pity her for it. Real work just needed doing. I told you it wasn't kept proper, Garrick said, watching her face like he expected her to turn around and walk back out the door. It's not as bad as you think, Alara said. You haven't looked under the stove yet. I will. She walked further into the room, running her fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood under the grime. This is a good stove. Good table, too, once it's scrubbed. The bones of this kitchen are sound, Mr. Hale. It's just been left to itself too long, same as a field left fallow. It hasn't forgotten how to grow things. It just needs somebody to plant in it again. He didn't say anything to that, but she caught him looking at her with an expression she'd remember later, even though she couldn't name it in the moment. Something between surprise and a kind of cautious hope, the look of a man who'd stopped expecting good things to walk through his door and wasn't sure what to do now that one had. There's flour in this pantry, he said finally. Salt pork, some beans, potatoes gone soft but not rotten. I'll send Cal into town tomorrow for whatever else you need, within reason. I'm not a rich man, Mrs. Whitlock, not anymore, not with cattle prices the way they've been, but I'll feed my house proper if you can make it happen. I can make it happen, Alara said. He nodded once, like that settled something, and turned to go check on the hands, pausing at the door. There's water out back if you want to wash up before you start. No sense cooking with berry stains on your hands. Thank you, Alara said, and meant it more than the words could carry. After he'd gone, she stood alone in the ruined kitchen for a long moment, just breathing it in. The smell of neglect, the dust motes turning slow in the thin light coming through a window that hadn't been cleaned in longer than she wanted to guess. Her stomach twisted with hunger so sharp it nearly buckled her, and she pressed a hand against it, hard, the way you'd press a hand against a wound to slow the bleeding. All right, she said out loud, to nobody, to the empty kitchen, to herself. All right, let's see what you've got. She found the woodpile around back, half collapsed and damp on one side from rain that had gotten under the lean-to roof, but dry enough underneath that she could build a fire that would catch. Her hands shook a little as she worked. 6 weeks of half-starving did that to a body, made even simple tasks feel like climbing a hill. But she got the stove lit, and the warmth of it against her face felt like the first kind thing that had happened to her in longer than she wanted to admit. She scrubbed the skillet first, scraping the burned mess out with the edge of a knife, then set about the rest of the kitchen with the kind of focused, furious energy that came from a person who'd had nothing to control in her life for 6 weeks and had finally been handed something she could. By the time the sun started sliding west, the table was clear, the floor swept, and a pot of beans simmered on the stove with salt pork and a little of the wild onion she'd found growing stubborn near the back fence, the kind of thing most folks walked right past without noticing. But Alara had spent 6 weeks learning to notice anything that might be eaten. She'd found a sack of cornmeal in the pantry too, gone a little stale but not spoiled, and mixed up a batch of cornbread with what fat she could spare, sliding it into the oven just as she heard boots on the porch outside. Garrett came in first, pulling off his hat, and stopped just inside the door. The change in the kitchen hit him visibly. She watched it land on his face, watched his eyes move from the clean table to the swept floor to the pot on the stove, and something in his jaw went tight, like a man holding back more feeling than he meant to show. "You did all this since noon?" "I had motivation," Alara said, stirring the beans. "Hunger does wonders for a person's pace." He didn't laugh, but something close to it moved at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as fast as it came. The 3 hands filed in behind him, and Alara watched their faces do the same thing Garrick's had. Cal's eyebrows going up, Otis letting out a low whistle, even Bertie pausing in the doorway a beat longer than usual. "Lord Almighty," Cal said, then caught himself, glancing at Alara like he wasn't sure if he ought to apologize for the language. "Sorry, ma'am, it's just, this don't look like the same kitchen." "It's the same kitchen," Alara said. "It just remembered what it's for." They sat down to eat, beans thick with salt pork and onion, cornbread still steaming when she cut it, and a jar of preserved peaches she'd found tucked in the back of the pantry that she figured nobody had thought to use because nobody had thought to look. She set the table the way her mother had taught her, even with mismatched plates and chipped cups, because the way a thing was presented mattered almost as much as what it was. And these men had been eating off bare boards and out of pots for longer than was good for anybody's spirit. The first bite of cornbread went around the table, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, which Alara understood after 6 weeks of hunger to be its own kind of compliment, the silence of men who were too busy eating to talk. "Ma'am," Otis said finally, around a mouthful, "I take back every doubting thing I thought when Garrick rode up with a stranger on the back of his horse." "You doubted me?" "I doubt everybody till they prove different," Otis said. "It's kept me alive this long." "Fair enough," Alara said, and found herself almost smiling, the muscles in her face working at something they hadn't done in weeks. Cal had gone quiet in the way of a young man eating like he hadn't in days, which maybe he hadn't, given what Garrick had said about burnt beans. Bertie ate slower, more careful, but Alara noticed he went back for a second piece of cornbread before anyone else had finished their first, which told her plenty without him saying a word. Garrick ate without much comment, but she caught him watching the table once or twice. Not her exactly, but the whole scene of it, the 4 people gathered around food that had been cooked with care, like he was looking at something he'd forgotten was possible. After supper, while the hands went back out to check the stock before full dark, Garrick lingered a moment in the kitchen doorway. $4 a week isn't much," he said. "Not for what you did today." "It's more than I had this morning," Alara said, scraping the last of the dishes into the basin. "I'm not in a position to argue wages, Mr. Hale, and I wouldn't even if I were. A bed and honest work is worth more to me right now than money." Still, he turned his hat over in his hands, an old habit she'd come to learn later, something he did when he was working up to saying a thing that didn't come easy. "You did good work today. Better than good. I want you to know I noticed it." "Thank you," Alara said, and meant it, because being noticed, really noticed, for the work of her hands and not for the pity of her circumstances, was a thing she hadn't felt in longer than the 6 weeks since Thomas died. If she was honest with herself, it had been longer than that. Thomas had never much noticed what she did. Not toward the end. Not once the debt started piling up. and his mind went somewhere dark and far away from the house they shared. "Loft's up that ladder," Garrick said, nodding toward the corner of the kitchen. "Small, but it's dry, and it's got a window that catches the morning sun. I'll have Cal bring up some blankets." "I'll manage," Alara said. "I've managed worse." He looked at her for a moment, that same careful look from the road, like he was still doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "I imagine you have." That night, lying in the narrow loft bed with a blanket Cal had brought up, smelling faintly of horse and wood smoke, Alara stared up at the rough timber ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. The creak of old wood cooling after the day's heat, the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere out in the dark, the wind picking up against the walls. Her stomach was full for the first time in 6 weeks, properly full, and the strangeness of that feeling kept her awake almost as much as the hunger ever had. She thought about Thomas, briefly, the way you think about a wound that's mostly healed but still aches in certain weather. Not with the raw grief of the early weeks, but with a kind of tired sorrow for the life they might have had if he hadn't let his troubles eat him alive from the inside before the fever ever got to him. She thought about the house they'd lost, the bed she'd sold, the silver that had gone for less than it was worth, because she'd been too desperate to haggle. And she thought about the man downstairs, Garrick Hale, with his careful eyes and his quiet grief and his ranch gone to seed around him like a man too tired to fight off the wilderness anymore. A house that's forgotten what it's for, she'd called it, and she'd meant the kitchen, but lying there in the dark, she understood she'd meant more than that. The whole place had a kind of hollowness to it, the same hollowness she recognized in her own chest most mornings since Thomas died. Not exactly sadness anymore, just absence, the shape of something that used to be there. She thought about the way the hands' faces had changed at supper, the way Garrick's jaw had gone tight looking at a clean table, and something settled in her then, quiet and certain as a stone dropping to the bottom of a still pond. She didn't have money. She didn't have land or family or any of the things that made a person secure in this world. But she had 2 working hands and a mind that didn't quit, and she had just been handed something she hadn't expected to find again after Thomas's debt swallowed her whole life. A place where her work meant something, where effort could actually change the shape of things instead of just delaying the inevitable. She wasn't going to waste it, lying there in the dark, with the wind pressing against the timber walls and the smell of wood smoke still clinging to the borrowed blanket. Alara Whitlock made herself a promise, silent and fierce, the kind of promise a person makes when they've got nothing left to lose and everything still to prove. She was going to fix this house. Not just the kitchen, not just the dust and the grime and the broken hinges, though she'd get to all of that too. She was going to fix the quiet that hung over the place like a held breath, the kind of quiet that came from people who'd stopped expecting anything good to happen to them. She'd been that kind of quiet herself these past 6 weeks. She knew the shape of it from the inside. Garrick Hale had asked her a simple question on a dirt road that morning. "Can you cook for 2?" And she'd said yes because she was hungry and desperate and out of better options. But lying in the dark now, full for the first time in weeks, listening to a ranch house breathe around her like something only half alive, she understood the question had been bigger than cooking, even if neither of them had known it standing there in the cold morning wind. Somewhere out past the window, an owl called once, low and steady, and then the night went quiet again, settling over the valley like a blanket pulled up against the cold. Alara closed her eyes. Tomorrow there'd be more work, scrubbing the floors properly, going through the pantry to see what else had been let go to waste. Maybe getting a look at that vegetable patch she'd noticed gone to weeds near the side of the house, because a working garden could mean the difference between scraping by and actually thriving once the warmer months came in. There'd be the hands to feed again, and Garrick's careful watching eyes to win over a little more, and 100 small battles against a house that had given up on itself. But for tonight, for the first time in 6 weeks, Alara Whitlock fell asleep without the gnawing ache of hunger keeping her awake, and without the particular despair of a woman who'd run clean out of road. She had a place now, a purpose, however small it might look to anyone passing by on the Two Forks Road, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the grief she was still carrying for a husband who hadn't deserved the worst of her loyalty, something in her had started, quietly, to hope. Morning came in gray and cold, the kind of light that made the frost on the window glass look like lace, and Alara was already awake before it fully broke, lying in the loft listening to the house creak and settle around her. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten could ache, knees, shoulders, the small of her back, from a day of scrubbing and bending and hauling water that her muscles hadn't done in longer than she wanted to admit. But underneath the ache was something else, something that felt almost unfamiliar after 6 weeks of hollow desperation, purpose. She climbed down the ladder before the sun was fully up, moving quiet so as not to wake the house, and found the kitchen exactly as she'd left it, clean, the dishes dried and stacked, the stove cold but ready to be coaxed back to life. She built the fire first, her hands steadier this morning than they'd been the day before, and set water to boil while she went through the pantry by lamplight, taking real stock of what she had to work with. It wasn't much: flour, cornmeal, the last of the salt pork, a sack of dried beans, some potatoes that needed sorting through to find the ones still good, a tin of coffee, half empty, no eggs, no fresh milk, no butter beyond a small crock that had gone a little rancid at the edges. She'd need Cal's trip to town sooner than Garrick had figured, if she was going to feed 5 people through a Wyoming spring without the meals turning monotonous and thin. She was elbow deep in the flour barrel, checking it for weevils, when she heard boots on the porch and looked up to find Garrick standing in the doorway, hat already on, looking like a man who'd been up even before she had. "Didn't expect you down here this early," he said. "Didn't expect to sleep this late," Elara answered, which wasn't quite true. She'd been awake before dawn, but it was true enough in spirit. "I was just working out what we've got and what we don't." And we don't have much," she said plainly, because she'd already decided in the night that pretending otherwise would only waste both their time. "Flour's good for another few weeks if I'm careful with it. Beans will hold, but there's no eggs, no fresh milk, the butter's turning, and if you want this kitchen putting out anything better than beans and cornbread every night, I'll need more than what's in this pantry." Garrick leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, listening with the kind of attention she hadn't expected from a man who, by his own account, mostly let his ranch run itself through habit and necessity. "What would you want, if you could have it?" "Hens for a start. Even 4 or 5 would give us eggs enough to matter, and eggs go a long way. Breakfast, baking, stretching a meal further than it'd go otherwise. A milk cow, if you've got one to spare from the herd, or can trade for one. Seed for a garden, come spring. I saw the plot out back, gone to weed, but the soil looked decent under all that mess. And sugar, salt, more coffee, if the money allows it." "Money's tight," Garrick said, not unkindly, just factual, the way he seemed to say most things. "Cattle prices have been low 2 years running. I'm not destitute, but I'm not flush either, and I won't pretend otherwise to you." "I'm not asking you to spend what you don't have," Elara said. "I'm telling you what would make this house run better, and you can decide for yourself what's worth doing now and what waits. I learned plenty about getting by on little these past weeks, Mr. Hale. I'm not going to waste what you do give me." He studied her a moment, and something in his face shifted, the same careful, assessing look she'd seen on the road. "Hens, I can manage," he said finally. "There's a fella 2 miles east, Dunmore, keeps more chickens than he knows what to do with. I'll ride over, see what he'll trade. As for a milk cow, I've got a young heifer that'll calve come summer, ought to be in milk by then. Until then, we'll do without, unless Dunmore's got a cow to spare too." "That's more than fair," Elara said. "And the garden seed I can get from town when Cal goes. Sugar and coffee too, within reason." He paused. "You drive a hard bargain for a woman who told me yesterday she wasn't in a position to argue." "I'm not arguing wages," Elara said. "I'm telling you how to get the most out of what you're already paying for. There's a difference." That earned her something close to a real smile, brief as it was, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but she'd seen it, and something in her chest eased a little at having put it there. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Elara hadn't realized she'd been hungry for. Not just hungry for food, though that hunger was being properly answered now too, but hungry for the kind of order that came from useful, repeated work. She rose before dawn, built the fire, started the coffee, and by the time the hands came in from the early chores, breakfast was on the table. Biscuits, when she had the fat to spare for them. Eggs once. Garrick brought the hens back from Dunmore's place, tied up in a crate, and looking thoroughly unhappy about the journey, and always coffee strong enough to wake a dead man, because she'd learned quick that cowboys judged a cook first and hardest by her coffee. "This is the best coffee I've had since I left Missouri," Otis announced on the 3rd morning, holding his cup like a man cradling something precious. And that was 11 years ago, so that's saying plenty. 11 years is a long time to go without good coffee, Alara said, refilling Cal's cup before he even had to ask. 11 years is a long time to do a lot of things, Otis said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Alara wonder what particular things he meant. But she didn't ask, because she'd learned already that a ranch full of men carried its history close and didn't hand it out easy. Cal, for his part, had taken to lingering in the kitchen longer than strictly necessary most mornings, finding reasons to ask Alara questions about cooking, about Missouri, about anything at all, in the eager way of a young man who'd grown up around rough company and wasn't quite sure how to talk to a woman who treated him like a person worth talking to instead of just another mouth to feed. "How'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked one morning, watching her work the dough for biscuits with quick, practiced hands. "My mother taught me," Alara said, "and then I taught myself the rest, out of necessity, same as most things a person learns properly. You don't really know how to cook until you've had to make a little bit of nothing stretch into a meal for people who are counting on you. You make it look easy." "It isn't," Alara said, "but there's no use making everyone around you suffer through watching you struggle at it. A kitchen runs better when the person in it looks like she knows what she's doing, even on the days she's not so sure." Cal turned that over for a moment, chewing on it the way he chewed on most things she said to him, slow and thoughtful in a way that didn't match the easy chatter he usually offered. "That's good advice for more than cooking, I reckon." "Most good advice is," Alara said, and set the biscuits in to bake. Bertie remained the hardest of the three hands to read, quiet through most meals, careful in the way he watched the kitchen change around him, like a man waiting to see if the good thing in front of him was going to last or vanish the way good things sometimes did. It was nearly 2 weeks before he said more than a few words to her at once, and when he finally did, it came almost sideways while she was hanging wash on the line and he was walking past with a coil of rope over his shoulder. "You sing while you work," he said, stopping a few feet off. Alara paused, a wet shirt half pinned. "I didn't realize I did." "You do. Quiet, mostly. Don't think you notice you're doing it." Bertie shifted the rope on his shoulder. "My mother used to do the same. Hummed when she was canning, mostly. Haven't heard anybody do that around here in a long while." "Is that a complaint?" "No, ma'am." He almost smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward before settling back into its usual careful stillness. "It's a good thing to hear again. That's all I meant." He walked on before she could think of what to say back, and Alara stood there a moment with the wet shirt still in her hands, feeling something warm settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun overhead. The kitchen itself transformed over those first weeks in ways that went beyond just clean dishes and a swept floor. Alara scrubbed the walls down with vinegar water until the old grease stains lightened, mended the curtain over the window with thread she found in a forgotten sewing basket tucked under a loose floorboard. A basket that had clearly belonged to Margaret once, judging by the careful, even stitches already begun on a half-finished piece of mending that Alara found folded inside. Work interrupted 3 years ago and never picked back up. She held that unfinished mending in her hands for a long moment the first time she found it, feeling the weight of it, the particular sorrow of work left undone by a woman who never got the chance to finish it. She didn't say anything to Garrick about it. Some things, she'd come to understand already in her short time on this ranch, were better handled quiet, without drawing more attention to a wound than it needed. She found other traces of Margaret scattered through the house as she cleaned, slow and respectful, never rushing into the corners of the place like she was trying to erase what had come before her. A hairpin caught in a floorboard crack, a recipe written in careful, looping handwriting tucked into the back of a cookbook, a small portrait, faded with age and damp, of a young woman with dark hair and a serious mouth, set on a shelf in the front room gathering dust. Alara dusted the portrait carefully, the same way she dusted everything else, and set it back exactly where she'd found it. She wasn't here to replace anyone. She understood that plainly, the same way she understood that grief didn't work on anyone else's schedule but its own, and a person, or a house, healed at the pace it healed, and pushing too hard against that only broke things further. The vegetable plot took longer to bring back, but by the 3rd week she'd cleared the worst of the weeds, turned the soil with a borrowed spade that left blisters on her palms, thick enough to pop and scar, and put in the first rows of seed Cal had brought back from town. Onions, carrots, early peas, a hill of squash she didn't expect much from this late in planting it, but figured was worth the gamble. Garrick found her out there one evening, Kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves pushed up and dirt under her fingernails she doubted would ever fully wash out, patting soil over the last row of peas as the light went gold and long across the valley. "You don't have to do the garden too," he said, standing at the edge of the plot with his hat pushed back. "I hired you to cook." "You hired me to keep your house," Ilara said, not looking up from her work. "A garden's part of keeping a house, same as a clean floor or a full pantry. Besides," she sat back on her heels, looking up at him finally, squinting against the low sun, "I like it. There's something satisfying about putting a seed in the ground and knowing, more or less, what's going to come of it. Most things in life don't work that simple." "No," Garrick agreed, something heavy moving behind his eyes. "They don't." He crouched down beside her, surprising her, and picked up a handful of the loose soil, working it between his fingers the way a man does when he's testing whether ground is good for growing or not. "This was Margaret's garden once, before." Ilara's hands went still. "I wondered. You found her things in the house, the mending, the recipe book." It wasn't a question. "I figured you would, eventually, going through everything the way you have been." "I didn't touch anything that wasn't mine to clean," Ilara said carefully. "I wasn't looking to pry." "I know that." He let the dirt fall from his fingers, brushing his palm against his trouser leg. "I'm not upset about it, if that's what you're worried over. It's been 3 years. Things needed cleaning, whether her hand was the last one to touch them or not." He paused, looking out over the half-planted rows. "She had a garden going the spring she died. Never got past putting the seed in. I let it go fallow after, couldn't bring myself to touch it, and it just sat there going to weed every year since, like some kind of—" He stopped, like he wasn't sure how to finish the thought or wasn't sure he wanted to. "Like a wound you kept picking at without meaning to," Ilara offered quietly. He looked at her, something raw moving across his face for just a moment before he got it back under control. "Something like that." "I'm not trying to erase her," Ilara said, "out here or in the house. I want you to know that. I found her things, and I treated them with the respect they deserved, and I'll keep doing that for as long as I'm here. But a garden left fallow doesn't honor anybody, Mr. Hale. It just sits there reminding you of what's gone, instead of growing something new in its place. I figured she'd rather see peas coming up than weeds, if she had any say in it." Garrick was quiet a long moment, looking out at the rows of turned earth, the first pale shoots of something already pushing up at the far end where she'd planted the earliest seed a week back. "You're probably right," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Margaret wasn't a woman who liked to sit still and mourn things. She'd have hated watching that garden go to seed for 3 years near as much as I hated doing it to her." "Then it's done now," Ilara said simply. "No use feeling guilty over getting around to a thing later than you should have. The peas don't care when you planted them, so long as they're in the ground before it's too late in the season." He huffed something that might have been a laugh, surprised out of him. "You've got a strange way of comforting a man, Mrs. Whitlock." "I've never claimed to be comforting," Ilara said, standing and brushing the dirt from her knees. "Just honest. Comfort wears off. Honesty tends to stick." It was around the start of the 4th week that the real shift in the ranch became impossible to ignore, not just in the house, but in the men who worked it. Ilara noticed it first at the supper table. The easy-way conversation had started flowing where before there'd only been the scrape of forks and the occasional grunt of agreement. Otis had taken to telling stories about his years in Missouri, each one a little taller than the last, and Cal had started arguing back at him good-naturedly instead of just listening in silence, the two of them going back and forth about whether a man could really wrestle a bear the way Otis claimed to have done once, with Bertie occasionally throwing in a dry comment that landed harder for how rarely he spoke at all. "You did not wrestle a bear, Otis," Cal said one evening, around a mouthful of stew. "You've told that story 4 different ways now. First, it was a black bear, then it was a grizzly, and tonight you're saying it had cubs with it, which means you are either the bravest fool in Missouri or the story's growing a new leg every time you tell it." "Maybe both things are true," Otis said with great dignity. "A man can be brave and a fool at the same time. Most brave men are." "He wasn't anywhere near a bear," Bertie said quietly, not looking up from his plate. "He got chased up a tree by his neighbor's hog, and it's turned into a bear by the 3rd telling every year since." The table erupted into laughter, even Garrick's mouth twitching up at the corner despite himself, and Otis sputtered indignantly about slander and disrespect for his elders. But he was laughing too underneath the protest, and Alara stood at the stove watching the whole scene with something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. This was what a house was supposed to sound like. Not silence and burnt beans eaten alone in shifts, but this: noise and argument and laughter. Men who'd been worn thin by isolation and grief finding their way back to something like ease with each other. Garrick caught her watching and held her gaze a moment across the table, something unspoken passing between them that neither of them tried to name out loud. He didn't say anything about it, not then, but later that night, after the hands had gone out to the bunkhouse and Alara was finishing the last of the dishes, he lingered in the kitchen doorway the way he'd taken to doing most evenings. "They're different," he said. "The men, I mean. Since you came." "People generally are when they're fed properly and treated decent," Alara said, not turning from the basin. "It's not magic, Mr. Hale. Just attention. It's more than that, and you know it." His voice had an edge of something almost frustrated in it, like he was working up to saying a thing that didn't come easy to a man who guarded his words as carefully as he guarded everything else. "Otis hasn't told a story at this table in over 2 years. Cal stopped talking about leaving for the railroad work, which he used to bring up every other week like he was testing whether anybody'd try to stop him. Even Bertie's talking more than I've heard him talk since his brother passed." Alara turned from the basin, drying her hands on her apron, surprised by the weight in his voice. "Bertie lost a brother? 2 years back. Mining accident over near Deadwood. Bertie was the one who had to write the letter home to their mother on account of he was the only one of them who could write proper. Hasn't been the same since, not till lately." Garrick rubbed a hand over his jaw, tired in a way that went deeper than the day's work. "Point is, you've done something to this place that I haven't been able to do in 3 years of trying, or not trying, mostly, if I'm honest about it. I stopped trying a long while back, just kept the cattle fed and let the rest of it go." "You were grieving," Alara said, not unkindly. "There's no shame in that. A person can only carry so much before something has to be set down, even if it's the wrong thing to set down. Maybe." He looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "I want to thank you properly. Not just the wages. For—" He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, the whole transformed shape of the place. "All of it. I didn't know how much I'd let slip till I watched you bring it back." "You don't need to thank me," Alara said, though something in her chest ached pleasantly at the words anyway. "I'm doing the work I'm paid to do. You're doing a great deal more than the work you're paid to do, and we both know it." He said it plainly, no room for argument in his tone, and Alara found she didn't have one to offer anyway. "Then you're welcome," she said simply. "For whatever it's worth." "It's worth plenty," Garrick said, and there was something in the quiet certainty of his voice that stayed with her long after he'd gone out to check the stock one last time before bed. The weeks rolled forward into proper spring, the hills around the ranch going from brown to a tentative green, the garden coming up in earnest rows that Alara checked every morning with something close to pride, watching the first true leaves unfurl on the pea plants, the carrot tops feathering up out of the dark soil. The hens Garrick had traded for settled into a coop Cal built for them out of scrap lumber, and within a few weeks Alara had eggs enough to bake properly, which opened up the kitchen to things she hadn't been able to manage before. A real cake for Otis's birthday, which left the old man so flustered with gratitude he had to leave the table for a minute to collect himself, claiming dust in his eye, though there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere near the freshly scrubbed kitchen. Garrick, for his part, had started coming in earlier some evenings, not lingering by the door the way he had those first weeks, but sitting at the table while Alara finished the last of the cooking, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in a silence that had stopped feeling heavy and started feeling something closer to companionable. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked one evening, turning his coffee cup slow between his hands. "Family, maybe. Somewhere that isn't quite so much work for a body." "No family worth going back to," Alara said. "My mother passed when I was 19. Father remarried a woman who never much cared for me, and I haven't spoken to either of them in years. Thomas was supposed to be my family, and look how that turned out." She said it without much bitterness, just plain fact, the way she'd learned to say most hard things by now. "No, Mr. Hale, there's nothing back east for me. Whatever I've got now, I've got to build it from here." "Garrick," he said. She looked up from the stove. What? You keep calling me Mr. Hale. Feels strange considering you've been living under my roof going on a month now, cooking my meals, fixing my garden, mending my hand spirits better than I managed in years of trying. He said it without much weight, just an observation, but something in it landed differently than his usual careful, measured speech. Garrick's fine. All right, Ilara said, testing the name out loud for the first time. Garrick. Something passed between them in that moment, brief and unspoken. The kind of thing that didn't need naming to be felt all the same. Ilara turned back to the stove before it could grow into something neither of them was ready to examine too closely, and Garrick cleared his throat and asked about supper, and the moment folded itself away into the ordinary rhythm of the evening. Though it didn't disappear entirely, it just settled somewhere quiet, waiting. It was near the end of that 4th week that the first real trouble showed itself, though Ilara didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. Just a letter that came up from town with the supplies Cal brought back, addressed to Garrick in a careful, official hand, the kind of handwriting that belonged to men who dealt in numbers and not in cattle or crops. She watched Garrick read it at the table after supper, watched his face go still and then tight in a way she hadn't seen since that first morning on the road, when he'd asked about her husband and she'd watched something old and tired move behind his eyes. Bad news? She asked, when the silence had stretched long enough that even Otis had stopped his usual chatter, glancing between Garrick and the letter with a kind of weary recognition, like he'd seen this particular shape of bad news before. Bank, Garrick said, folding the letter back along its creases with more care than the moment seemed to call for, like handling it gently might somehow lessen what it said. Loans coming due end of summer. They want to know my plans for repayment, given how the cattle market's been running. How bad is it? Ilara asked, because she'd learned by now that there wasn't much sense dancing around hard questions with this man. He answered better to plain talk than to softened edges. Garrick was quiet a moment, weighing how much to say, and Ilara understood that hesitation too. A man used to carrying his troubles alone, not used to having someone at the table who might actually want to share the weight of them. Bad enough, he said finally. I took a loan against the ranch 2 years back when the winter killed off near a third of my herd, and I needed seed money to rebuild the numbers. Prices were supposed to recover by now. They haven't. Not enough, anyway. He rubbed a hand over his face, looking older in that moment than Ilara had seen him look yet. I've got cattle enough to sell come fall, but at these prices I'm not sure it covers what I owe, not with the interest piling on top of it. What happens if it doesn't cover it? Then the bank takes the difference out of the land, Garrick said flatly. That's how these things work. I lose acreage, maybe enough of it that what's left isn't worth running cattle on at all. Or I lose the whole thing outright, depending on how generous they're feeling, which from this letter doesn't sound like much. The table had gone quiet. Even Cal's usual restless energy stilled into something solemn, and Ilara felt the weight of the news settle over the kitchen like a fog rolling down off the hills. The same hollow dread she recognized from her own months of watching Thomas's debts swallow everything they'd built together, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a grave and a road and a handful of shriveled berries. She wasn't going to let that happen here. Not without a fight, anyway. The thought arrived in her chest fully formed and certain, surprising her with its intensity. There's time before end of summer, she said, keeping her voice steady, practical, the way she'd learned to keep it through her own worst months. Months yet. That's time enough to figure something. Figure what? Garrick said, and there was an edge of real bitterness in it now, the first she'd heard from him. I've been running this ranch 8 years. I know cattle and I know land, and I'm telling you, there's no figuring your way out of a market that's run dry. I can work twice as hard, and it won't put a single extra dollar in cattle prices that aren't there to be had. Maybe not, Ilara said, but sitting here tonight deciding it's already lost isn't going to help either. You've got months. Use them. Don't waste them feeling sorry for what hasn't happened yet. He looked at her sharply, something flaring behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but close to it. The particular frustration of a proud man being told something true that he didn't want to hear. You don't know what it's like, he said, watching something you've spent your whole life building slip away because of numbers you can't control. Don't I? Ilara's voice came out sharper than she meant it to, and she didn't soften it. I watched my husband gamble away everything we had, piece by piece, while I sat in that house pretending I didn't see it happening because admitting it meant admitting there was nothing I could do. I ate berries off a dead bush 6 weeks ago because I had nothing left, Garrick. Don't tell me I don't know what it's like to watch something slip away. The kitchen had gone dead silent. Otis was staring hard at his coffee cup like it had become suddenly fascinating. Cal looked between Alara and Garrick with wide eyes, clearly unsure whether to stay or make himself scarce. Bertie, characteristically, said nothing at all, but his eyes had sharpened with interest. Garrick's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again, quieter this time, some of the edge gone out of his voice. "You're right," he said. "That was unfair of me." "It was," Alara agreed, not willing to let him off easy just because he'd apologized. "But I understand the fear underneath it. I'm not angry at you for being afraid, Garrick. I'm only asking you not to let the fear decide things before they've happened. There's a difference between facing trouble honestly and giving up on it before it's even arrived." He was quiet a long moment, looking at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite name, something humbled, maybe, or something closer to gratitude wrapped up tight in pride that didn't want to show itself too plainly in front of the hands. "All right," he said finally. "We've got till end of summer. I'll think on it." "We'll think on it," Alara corrected quietly, and something in the way she said it, the simple certainty of including herself in his trouble without being asked, seemed to land on him harder than anything else said that evening. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful eyes, and didn't argue the point. Over the following days, the worry sat under the surface of the ranch like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it touching everything even when nobody spoke of it directly. Alara noticed Garrick spending longer hours out checking the herd, riding the fence lines with a grim set to his shoulders that hadn't been there before the letter arrived. The hands worked harder too, in the quiet way men did when they understood, without being told outright, that their livelihoods were tangled up in whatever was coming. But Alara found herself doing something else entirely in those evenings after supper. When the kitchen was clean and the house had gone quiet, she pulled out the ranch ledger Garrick kept in a drawer of the old desk in the front room, the one that listed every head of cattle, every expense, every debt and asset laid out in his careful, blocky handwriting, and she began to read. It started almost by accident, a curiosity she couldn't quite explain even to herself, except that she'd spent 4 years watching Thomas's finances unravel without understanding enough to stop it, and she wasn't about to make that same mistake twice. If trouble was coming for this house too, she wanted to understand its shape before it arrived. She read by lamplight after the house had gone to sleep, tracing her finger down columns of numbers. Head count, weight estimates, the going rate per pound that had indeed sunk lower than she'd realized, the original loan amount, and the interest accruing against it month over month like a slow, patient predator. She didn't understand all of it at first, but she had a sharp mind for numbers, always had. Even back when Thomas used to wave away her questions about their own finances with a careless hand, telling her not to trouble herself over things she wouldn't understand anyway. She'd understood plenty in the end, just too late to do anything about it. This time she promised herself, turning another page of Garrick's ledger by the low lamp flame, she'd understand it early enough to matter. She found Garrick in the kitchen one such evening, near a week after the letter had arrived, standing at the window looking out at the dark shape of the barn against the moonlit hills, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. "Can't sleep?" she asked, setting down the ledger she'd carried with her, not bothering to hide what she'd been doing with it. He glanced at the book in her hands, something flickering across his face. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to discomfort at having his private trouble examined so closely by someone who, a month ago, had been a stranger eating berries off a roadside bush. "You've been reading my books," he said, not quite an accusation, but close to one. "I have," Alara said plainly, refusing to apologize for it. "I told you I wasn't going to sit here doing nothing while trouble came for this house. I meant it." "And what have you found, going through my numbers?" There was an edge in his voice, pride bristling at the intrusion, even as something else underneath it, curiosity, maybe, or a tired kind of hope, seemed to be waiting for her answer despite himself. "I found that you're a careful record keeper," Alara said. "Every head counted, every dollar spent. That's good. It means there's nothing hidden in here, no surprises waiting to bite you that you haven't already accounted for." That? She paused. "I've also found that you've been underselling yourself for longer than the bank's been pressing you, Garrick. There's cattle in this ledger you've been counting at low estimates. the kind of conservative numbers a careful man writes down when he's preparing for the worst. That's not a bad habit, but it might be hiding something from you too. He turned from the window to look at her properly now, his tired eyes sharpening with real attention. What do you mean? I mean, I think you've got more cushion in this herd than you've let yourself believe, Alara said. But I'd need more time with these numbers to be sure of it. And I'd need to look at the herd itself, not just the page. She held his gaze steady. Will you let me? He studied her for a long moment, the kitchen quiet around them, but for the soft tick of the cooling stove, the distant call of some night bird out past the dark fields. Whatever pride had bristled in him a moment before seemed to settle, replaced by something more careful, more considering. The look of a man weighing a stranger's offer against his own exhausted certainty that there was nothing left to be done. All right, he said finally, his voice low and rough in the quiet kitchen. Look all you want, Alara. God knows I haven't found a way through this on my own. She didn't correct the small slip of familiarity in his words. The way her name came out of his mouth, instead of the formal address he'd kept to mostly until now. She only nodded, picking the ledger back up, already turning over numbers in her mind, already feeling the same fierce, focused determination that had carried her through scrubbing a ruined kitchen back to life, now turning itself toward a harder problem entirely. Outside, the wind moved soft across the dark hills, carrying with it the first real warmth of the coming season, and somewhere in the bunkhouse a dog barked once and went quiet again. The ranch slept on around them, unaware yet of the storm gathering on the horizon of summer's end, and unaware too of the quiet, careful war already beginning in a lamplit kitchen between a tired rancher's fear and a young widow's stubborn refusal to watch one more home slip away from her without a fight. The next morning, Alara was up before the sun again, but this time she didn't go straight to the stove. She pulled on her boots, wrapped a shawl over her shoulders against the early chill, and walked out to the corral where Garrick was already saddling his horse for the day's work. I want to see the herd, she said. All of it, if you can manage to show me without losing a full day's work doing it. Garrick looked at her like she'd asked to fly to the moon. It's near 400 head, Alara, spread over 600 acres. That's not something you walk out and look at over breakfast. Then show me what you can, she said. Start with whatever's closest. I want to understand what I'm working with before I go telling you what I think your numbers are hiding. He studied her a long moment, the same careful weighing look she'd come to recognize, and then, without much more argument, he held out his hand to help her up onto the second horse Cal had saddled for the morning's work, a sturdy bay mare, gentle enough for a rider out of practice. They rode out together into a morning gone soft gold with new light, the grass still wet with dew, and Garrick showed her the herd in sections. The main body grazing the lower pasture, calmer and slower moving than she'd expected, the calves born that spring sticking close to their mothers, the older steers held separate in a smaller fenced section nearer the barn. These 11, Garrick said, gesturing toward the smaller group as they rode past. I've been keeping back from the main count. They came in undersized last fall, off a neighboring spread that sold out and scattered its herd cheap. I picked them up for next to nothing, figuring I'd fatten them through winter and sell come spring, but they never quite caught up to where I wanted them. I've mostly written them off as a loss in my numbers. Figured they wouldn't bring much at market, not worth counting on. Alara reined her horse in, looking at the 11 steers grazing in their separate pen, and something in her chest went very still and very alert. How long have they been here? Since October. And what have they been eating? Garrick shrugged. Same as the rest. Grass, mostly. What hay we could spare through the worst of winter. No, Alara said slowly, a memory surfacing, sharp and sudden. Not just that. I've been feeding the kitchen scraps to the hogs all winter, same as you'd expect, but I started splitting it back in January. Sour milk, vegetable peelings, the leftover mash from the mornings I made porridge, the spoiled grain I cleared out of the pantry that first week. I didn't think much of it at the time, just didn't want to waste anything. And Cal mentioned there were some steers held back near the barn that could use the extra, so I had him carry the scrap bucket out there most mornings instead of straight to the hog pen. Garrick was staring at her now, something working behind his eyes. You've been feeding my steers since January and never said a word? It didn't seem worth mentioning, Alara said, feeling suddenly foolish, though something in her gut told her it mattered more than she'd realized at the time. It was scraps, Garrick. Leftover food that would have gone to the hogs anyway. I didn't think it was anything worth reporting on. He swung down off his horse without another word and walked into the pen, moving among the 11 steers with the practiced hands of a man who'd spent his whole life judging cattle by sight and touch, running a hand along flanks, checking weight and muscle the way Alara had seen him do with the rest of the herd on their ride out. She watched his face change as he worked through the group, surprise giving way to something sharper, more focused. "These aren't undersized anymore," he said, almost to himself. "These have put on weight steady since winter. Real weight, not just water and grass bloat. This one," he ran a hand along the back of a particularly solid-looking steer near the fence. "This one's near as heavy as anything in my main herd, and I'd written him off as a runt back in October." "Is that good?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the way his voice had changed. "It's better than good." Garrett climbed back through the fence rail, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and the first real spark of hope she'd seen on him since the letter arrived. "I had these counted as a loss, Alara. Wrote them off in the books as cattle not worth bringing to market. Figured I'd sell them cheap to whoever'd take them just to clear the feed cost off my hands. But if they've actually fattened up the way they look like they have..." He stopped, doing arithmetic in his head, his lips moving slightly the way a man does when he's working through numbers that matter more than he wants to say out loud yet. "How much," Alara said, "are 11 steers like that worth at current prices?" "Depends on the final weight when we bring them in, but if they're carrying what I think they're carrying," he looked at her, something almost wild behind his careful eyes, "it could be close to $400, maybe more, if the market holds steady through the summer." Alara felt her pulse pick up. She didn't know the full shape of the debt yet, hadn't seen the exact figure in the letter, but she knew enough from the worry that had hung over the kitchen table all week to understand that $400 wasn't nothing. It might not be everything, but it was something real, something that hadn't existed in his accounting a week ago, and something that had grown, quietly and unnoticed, out of nothing more than a widow's stubborn refusal to waste good food. "We need to recount the whole herd," she said, "properly. Not your conservative estimates, Garrick. Actual weights, actual numbers. The real shape of what you've got out here instead of what you've been telling yourself to brace for the worst." "That'll take days," he said. "Cal and Bertie and Otis will need to help drive sections in for proper weighing." "Then we start today," Alara said, already turning her horse back toward the house, her mind racing ahead to the ledger waiting in the front room desk drawer. "We've got months yet before the loan comes due. Let's not waste a single one of them assuming the worst before we've actually counted what's real." The recount took the better part of 2 weeks, worked in alongside the regular demands of the ranch, the hands driving small sections of the herd in from the far pastures each day to be properly weighed and tallied while Garrick and Alara worked through the numbers each evening at the kitchen table. The ledger spread open between them alongside sheets of scrap paper where Alara had begun keeping her own running calculations. It became, almost without either of them planning it, a kind of nightly ritual. The hands gone to the bunkhouse, the dishes cleared, a lamp burning low between them while they bent over columns of figures together, Garrick calling out weights and counts, while Alara worked the sums with a quick, sure hand that surprised him more each evening. "You're fast with numbers," he said one night, watching her tally a column of weights into a total without so much as pausing to check her work twice. "I kept Thomas's accounts for the first 2 years we were married," Alara said, not looking up from the page. "Before he decided I didn't need to trouble myself with it anymore. I was good at it, better than him, if I'm honest, though that wasn't a hard standard to clear." She finished the column, set down her pencil. "He stopped letting me near the books right around when things started going wrong. I used to think it was kindness, him not wanting to burden me with worry. Took me a long while to understand it was the opposite. He didn't want me seeing how bad it had gotten, because seeing it would have meant admitting it to himself too." Garrick was quiet a moment, watching her in the lamplight. That must have been a hard thing to live through. Knowing something was wrong, and not being let close enough to see how wrong. "It was," Alara said simply. "Which is why I'm not going to let it happen again. Not with my own house, and not with yours either, while I'm under your roof and able to do something about it." She looked up at him then, something steady and certain in her gaze. "You're going to see every number, Garrick. Every count, every estimate, every bit of trouble or hope this herd is carrying. I won't have you finding out too late the way I did. Something passed across his face. Gratitude, maybe. Or something that ran deeper than gratitude, harder to name in the quiet, lamp-lit kitchen. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with an expression that made her own breath catch slightly before he cleared his throat and pulled the ledger back toward himself, the moment folding away into the practical work of the evening once more. By the time the recount finished, the numbers told a story different from the one Garrick had been carrying in his chest for weeks. The main herd had weathered the winter better than his conservative estimates allowed. The spring calves were strong and numerous, and the 11 steers Alara had been unknowingly fattening all winter had come in even better than Garrick's first inspection suggested, closer to $450 at current market weight by Alara's most careful calculation. It wasn't enough. Not entirely. Not against the full weight of the loan and its accruing interest. But it was close. Closer than Garrick had let himself believe was possible since the letter first arrived, and for the first time in weeks, Alara watched something like real hope settle into the lines of his face instead of the grim, braced-for-loss expression he'd been wearing since spring. "We're not there yet," he said, looking over the final tally one more time, like he was afraid the numbers might shift if he looked away and back again. "But we're closer than I thought possible a month ago." "We've got the whole summer still," Alara said. "Prices might recover some. Calves will put on more weight before fall, and there's still the question of what else might be hiding in this ranch that you've been too tired or too cautious to count properly." "You think there's more?" "I think a man grieving as hard as you've been grieving these past 3 years probably hasn't been looking at his own ranch with clear eyes," Alara said, not unkindly. "I think you've been bracing for the worst so long, you stopped expecting anything good to turn up in the counting. I'd want to look at everything again, Garrick. Every corner, just to be sure." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, something working behind his careful eyes that went beyond gratitude now, into territory neither of them had named out loud yet, though it had been building, quiet and steady, through every shared evening at this table. "All right," he said finally, his voice rough. "Look at everything you want. I trust your eyes more than my own at this point." The trouble, when it finally arrived in full, came not as a letter this time, but as a man, riding up the Two Forks Road on a sleek, well-fed horse that stood in sharp contrast to the working stock on Garrick's ranch, dressed in a dark suit that looked entirely out of place against the dust and grass of the valley. Alara was hanging wash on the line when she saw him coming, and something in the careful, unhurried way he rode told her exactly what kind of man he was before he'd even reached the porch. She'd seen men like that before, back in the worst weeks of Thomas's decline. Men who came calling not with guns or threats, but with papers and patient, polite smiles, which were somehow worse, because there was no arguing with politeness, only with the cold arithmetic underneath it. "Garrick," she called toward the barn, where he was working with Otis on a fence repair. "Rider coming up the road." He came out wiping his hands on a rag, and Alara watched his face change the moment he got a clear look at the approaching figure, the easy hope of the past weeks draining out of him and replaced with something tight and guarded. "That's Harlan Pierce," he said low, mostly to himself. "Banks man out of Cheyenne." The rider drew up near the porch and dismounted with an unhurried grace. A man perhaps 40, lean and well-groomed in a way that spoke of a life spent indoors and at desks rather than in saddles, his mustache trimmed precise, his boots too clean for a man who'd ridden any real distance. "Mr. Hale," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that managed to look courteous and condescending at the same time. "I hope I find you well. Pierce." Garrick's voice was flat, careful. "Wasn't expecting you out this far. Letter said end of summer for the loan review." "Circumstances changed," Pierce said smoothly. "The bank's grown concerned given how the market's been trending. We've had several ranches default this season already, Mr. Hale, and the board has asked me to do an early assessment of accounts we consider," he paused delicately, "at risk. I'm sure you understand the position we're in." "I understand you're here 3 months early," Garrick said, "looking to find a reason to take my land before I've even had the chance to prove I can pay what I owe." Pierce's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, the polite mask settling more firmly into place. "I'm here to do an honest assessment, Mr. Hale. Nothing more. If your accounts are in good order, you've nothing to worry about." His gaze drifted, briefly, to Alara standing by the wash line. taking her in with a quick, assessing look that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. "Though I'll admit, I hadn't heard you'd taken a wife since my last visit." "She's my cook," Garrick said, an edge creeping into his voice that hadn't been there before. "And it's none of your concern either way." Of course, Pierce's tone suggested he didn't quite believe the explanation, but he let it go, turning his attention back to the matter at hand. "Shall we discuss the books, Mr. Hale? I'd like to see your current herd count and your projected income against the outstanding loan, if you don't mind." Garrick's jaw tightened, but he gestured toward the house. "Inside. No sense doing business standing in the yard like field hands." They went in together, and Alara, after a moment's hesitation, gathered the rest of the wash quickly and followed, some instinct telling her this was not a conversation she ought to miss, whatever propriety might suggest about a cook's place during the master's business dealings. Inside, Pierce settled himself at the kitchen table with the easy entitlement of a man used to being given space wherever he went, pulling papers from a leather case he'd carried in under his arm, while Garrick brought out the ledger and set it down across from him with considerably more reluctance. "Let's see," Pierce said, flipping through his own papers first. "The loan stands at $1,100 principal, with accrued interest bringing the current total owed to just over $1,300, due in full by September 1st, as per the original terms." He looked up. "Can you show me, Mr. Hale, how you intend to meet that obligation?" Garrick laid out his ledger, walking Pierce through the herd count, the recent recount Alara had pushed him toward, the projected weights and market value of the cattle he planned to bring to market come fall. Alara stood near the stove, not interrupting, watching Pierce's face carefully as he listened, noting the small, almost imperceptible ways his expression shifted, a flicker of something calculating behind his polite attention, the way his pen moved a little too quickly across his own papers, jotting figures that didn't quite seem to match what Garrick was telling him. "Your main herd projection looks reasonable," Pierce said finally, setting down his pen. "Though current market trends suggest prices may fall further before fall, not recover the way you're hoping. I'd advise against counting too heavily on speculative future pricing, Mr. Hale. The bank certainly won't." "That's a guess same as mine," Garrick said. "Prices have been low 2 years running. They've got to turn sometime." "Perhaps," Pierce said, in a tone that suggested he didn't believe it for a moment. "But the bank deals in certainties where it can find them, not hopeful guessing. Based on current prices, not your projected recovery, current prices, your herd as counted would bring approximately $900 at market. That leaves a shortfall of roughly $400 against your total obligation, Mr. Hale, which the bank would need to recover through other means." "Other means," Garrick repeated, his voice gone tight and low, "meaning the land." "Meaning whatever assets are necessary to satisfy the debt," Pierce said smoothly. "I'm not here to take pleasure in this, Mr. Hale. The bank simply cannot extend credit indefinitely against a property that isn't generating sufficient return to cover its obligations." Alara had been quiet through the whole exchange, watching, listening, her mind working steadily through everything Pierce had said, and more importantly, everything he hadn't. Something about his number didn't sit right with her. Not the math itself, which seemed plausible enough on its surface, but the conspicuous absence of any mention of the 11 steers, the very cattle she and Garrick had spent 2 careful weeks recounting and revaluing. "Mr. Pierce," she said, stepping forward from her place by the stove, "if I might ask a question." Pierce looked at her with mild surprise, as though he'd forgotten entirely that the cook standing in the corner might have a voice worth hearing. "Of course, Mrs. Whitlock," Alara said. "Your $900 figure, does that account for the full herd, including the 11 head held separately near the barn?" Something flickered across Pierce's face, there and gone so fast that if Alara hadn't been watching closely, she might have missed it entirely. "I worked from the figures Mr. Hale's previous correspondence with the bank indicated," he said smoothly. "I believe those 11 head were noted as a loss in earlier communications, not expected to bring significant value at market. That correspondence is months old," Alara said, keeping her voice level, polite, but firm underneath it. "Those 11 steers have been fattened considerably since then. We recounted and reweighed the entire herd just this past week, Mr. Pierce, including those 11 specifically, and they're now estimated at close to $450 combined at current market weight." Pierce's smile thinned just slightly, the polite mask slipping a fraction. I wasn't aware of any updated figures, Mrs. Whitlock. The bank works from the most recent official correspondence on file. Then perhaps the bank ought to look at the actual cattle, Alara said, rather than relying on figures Mr. Hale wrote down months ago, when he had every reason to be conservative in his estimates after a hard winter. Numbers on a page from last fall don't account for what's standing in that pen today, and I'd think a bank as careful with its certainties as you claim would want the most accurate count available before deciding a man's whole livelihood. The kitchen had gone very quiet. Garrick was watching Alara with an expression caught somewhere between astonishment and something fierce and proud he wasn't bothering to hide, while Pierce's composure, for the first time since he'd ridden up the road, showed real strain underneath its polished surface. "I'd need to verify those figures myself," Pierce said, recovering some of his smoothness, though his voice had lost its earlier easy confidence. "I can't simply take a cook's word for cattle weights, Mrs. Whitlock. No offense intended. These things require proper assessment." "None taken," Alara said evenly. "I'd expect nothing less than proper assessment, Mr. Pierce, which is why I'd suggest you walk out to that pen yourself, right now, and look at those 11 steers with your own eyes, rather than relying on outdated paperwork that conveniently leaves out $450 worth of cattle that would shrink your shortfall figure down to almost nothing." Pierce's jaw tightened visibly now, the polite veneer cracking further. "Are you suggesting I've been dishonest in my assessment, Mrs. Whitlock?" "I'm suggesting," Alara said, holding his gaze steady, refusing to back down the way she might have once, before 6 weeks of starvation and a month of hard work had taught her exactly how much steel she actually had in her spine. "That it's a curious coincidence, a bank representative arriving 3 months early for an assessment, working from figures that happen to leave out the one piece of the herd that would most change the outcome in Mr. Hale's favor." "I don't know your intentions, Mr. Pierce. I only know what the actual numbers say, and I'd be glad to walk you out to that pen myself if you'd like to verify them." For a long moment, nobody in the kitchen moved. Garrick's hands had gone still on the table, his eyes fixed on Pierce with an intensity that hadn't been there a few minutes before, the dawning understanding of what Alara was uncovering settling visibly across his face. Otis, who had drifted in from the porch at some point during the conversation and stood now in the doorway, let out a low whistle under his breath. Pierce stood abruptly, gathering his papers with hands that weren't quite as steady as they'd been when he arrived. "I think," he said, his voice tight, "it would be prudent for me to conduct a full reassessment before drawing any further conclusions today." "I think that's a fine idea," Alara said pleasantly. "Shall we walk out together? I can show you exactly where the weights were recorded, and Mr. Hale can show you the recount ledger from this past week. I'd hate for the bank to make a decision about a man's land based on incomplete information, Mr. Pierce. That hardly seems like the kind of certainty you claim to be working from." They walked out to the pen together, the whole strange procession of them, Pierce stiff and tight-lipped, Garrick with a barely suppressed fury simmering under his calm exterior, Alara walking steady and certain beside them with the recount ledger tucked under her arm, and Otis trailing along behind with the unmistakable look of a man who wouldn't have missed this for anything. At the pen, Pierce looked over the 11 steers with the careful, assessing eye of a man who clearly knew cattle better than he'd let on during his earlier dismissal of them, his jaw working as he took in their weight, their condition, the obvious evidence that these were not the undersized losses his outdated figures had suggested. "These have been well kept," he said finally, grudging, like the admission cost him something. "They have," Garrick said, his voice hard now, all pretense of polite business dealing stripped away. "Fed all winter on scraps that would have otherwise gone to the hogs, by a woman who understood the value of waste before either of us thought to look for it. Recounted properly just this week, Pierce, with real numbers, not the conservative guesswork I sent you back in the fall when I was bracing for a worse winter than we got." He stepped closer, something dangerous and quiet in his bearing now. "You came out here 3 months early hoping to catch me before I'd had the chance to recount, didn't you? Hoping I'd still be working off old numbers that made the shortfall look bigger than it actually is." "I came out here to do an honest assessment," Pierce said, but the words had lost their earlier smoothness, coming out clipped and defensive instead. "Did you?" Alara said, stepping forward with the ledger open in her hands. "Then I'd like you to explain, Mr. Pierce, why your own figures—" She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a column of numbers. "List the total herd at 389 head, When Mr. Hale's actual count, verified just this week with all hands present and witnessed, comes to 402. That's 13 head unaccounted for in your assessment. 13 head that, even at conservative pricing, would add considerably more value than the $400 shortfall you quoted us not 20 minutes ago. Pierce said nothing, his face gone pale and tight, and the silence stretched long enough that even Otis, standing a few feet back, shifted uncomfortably. I worked from the bank's records, Pierce said finally, weakly. Then the bank's records are wrong, Alara said. Or somebody at the bank found it convenient to work from old, undercounted figures when assessing a man 3 months ahead of schedule, hoping he wouldn't have the chance to catch the discrepancy before the bank moved to claim land it had no honest right to claim yet. She closed the ledger with a quiet, final snap. I don't know which it is, Mr. Pierce. I only know that the actual numbers, properly counted, leave Mr. Hale within striking distance of covering his full debt come September, not facing the shortfall you arrived here today prepared to exploit. Garrick stepped forward now, his voice low and hard as iron. I think you ought to ride back to Cheyenne, Pierce, and tell whoever sent you that Garrick Hale's books are in better order than the bank's, and that he'll have the full $1,300, plus interest, ready by September 1st, exactly as the original terms required. And I think you ought to tell them that if anybody from that bank tries this particular trick again, riding out early, working off conveniently outdated numbers, they'll find themselves dealing with more than just one stubborn rancher and his cook. Pierce's composure had fully cracked now, replaced by something tight and humiliated, a man unused to being caught out so plainly and so publicly. I'll need to confirm these figures with my own assessment, he said stiffly, before any official report can be filed. Confirm away, Alara said, holding the ledger out toward him. Every number's right here, plain as day, and you're welcome to verify each one yourself, out in that pen, with your own eyes, same as you should have done the moment you arrived instead of trying to rush Mr. Hale into a panic with old figures. Pierce took the ledger with stiff, reluctant hands, his eyes flicking over the columns with the particular discomfort of a man watching his own scheme unravel in real time. After a long moment, he closed it and handed it back without a word, his earlier smooth confidence entirely gone, replaced by something closer to chastened anger. I'll file an accurate report, he said finally, the words clearly costing him something, based on today's findings. See that you do, Garrick said. Pierce mounted his horse without further conversation, his earlier unhurried grace replaced now with something stiff and hurried, eager to be away from a yard where his careful plan had come apart at the seams in front of witnesses who wouldn't forget it. He rode off down the Two Forks Road without a backward glance, and the four of them stood watching him go until he disappeared around the bend, the dust of his passage settling slow behind him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Otis let out a low, delighted whoop that broke the tension entirely. Lord Almighty, he said, echoing Cal's earlier near curse from weeks past, I have never in my life seen a banker's face go that particular shade of pale. Mrs. Whitlock, I take back every other compliment I've paid your cooking, because that right there was the finest thing I've watched happen on this ranch in a decade. Garrick turned to Alara, and the look on his face stopped whatever else Otis might have said, something raw and unguarded moving across his features that he didn't bother trying to hide, not even with Otis standing right there watching. You knew, he said quietly, before we even walked out here. You knew his numbers were wrong. I suspected, Alara said. The shortfall he quoted didn't account for the 11 steers, and a man careful enough to ride out 3 months early with prepared figures isn't a man who makes that kind of mistake by accident. I just needed to see his numbers laid out to be sure of it. You saved this ranch, Garrick said, his voice rough with something that went beyond simple gratitude now. Pierce wasn't bluffing about that shortfall, not entirely. If he'd convinced me of it today, if I hadn't had you standing there catching what I missed, I might have panicked into some bad decision before September ever arrived. Sold off stock too early, taken a worse deal somewhere just to scrape together what I thought I owed. You didn't miss it because you're foolish, Alara said. You missed it because you've been carrying this worry alone for weeks, and a man carrying a weight like that long enough stops seeing clearly. That's all that happened here, Garrick. I just had fresh eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, the late afternoon sun slanting gold across the yard, catching the dust still hanging faint in the air from Pierce's hurried departure, and something passed between them that neither Otis's presence nor the ordinary business of the day seemed able to interrupt. A recognition, deep and quiet, of exactly what she had become to this ranch, and to him, in the short weeks since he'd found her kneeling in a roadside ditch with purple-stained fingers and nothing left to lose. Fresh eyes, he repeated softly, like the words meant more than their plain sense. I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't gotten down off that horse a month back. You'd have managed, Alara said, though her voice had gone a little unsteady too, something in his gaze pulling at her in a way she wasn't entirely ready to examine. You're a capable man, Garrick. You'd have found your way. Maybe, he said, but I'm glad I didn't have to find it alone. Otis, with the diplomatic instincts of a man who'd been around long enough to recognize a moment that didn't need an audience, cleared his throat loudly and announced something about checking on the south fence before supper, making himself scarce with more haste than the task likely required. Garrick and Alara stood alone in the yard a moment longer. The dust settled now, the late sun warm against the dry grass, the 11 steers grazing peaceful and oblivious in their pen behind them, worth considerably more than either Garrick or the bank had understood just a few hours before. Thank you, Garrick said finally, simple and plain, the words carrying more weight than their brevity suggested. Not just for today, for all of it. I don't think I've said that properly, not the way it deserves saying. You don't need to keep thanking me, Alara said, though something warm had settled deep in her chest at hearing it anyway. I'm just doing what needs doing, same as I've been doing since the day you found me on that road. It's more than that, Garrick said, and we both know it. He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken and steady passing between them in the gold evening light, before he finally looked away, clearing his throat, the ordinary business of the ranch reasserting itself around them. I should go check on Otis's fence work before he forgets he was supposed to be doing it. You should, Alara agreed, though neither of them moved right away, the moment stretching a beat longer than the practical business of the evening strictly required. He went, eventually, and Alara stood alone in the yard a while longer, watching the 11 steers graze undisturbed, feeling something settle in her chest that hadn't been there in longer than she wanted to count. Not just relief at the danger turned aside, though that was real and considerable, but something deeper than that, something that had been building quietly through every shared evening at the kitchen table, every careful conversation, every moment of trust extended and met. She turned back toward the house as the sun dropped lower over the western hills, already thinking ahead to supper, to the ordinary rhythm of the evening waiting to resume, but carrying with her the unmistakable knowledge that something between her and this ranch, and between her and the quiet man who owned it, had shifted today into something neither of them was quite ready to name out loud, though it had been growing steady and certain as the garden she'd planted, waiting only for the right season to fully bloom. The days after Pierce's hasty retreat down the Two Forks Road carried a different weight than any that had come before them. It wasn't relief exactly, not the full kind, because relief implied the trouble was entirely past, and both Garrick and Alara understood well enough that a bank humiliated once might come back sharper, more careful, less willing to be caught out twice. But it was something close to relief, a loosening in the chest that let a person breathe a little deeper than they had in weeks. Garrick wrote to the bank himself that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Alara across from him, helping him choose his words, careful and precise, laying out the full recount in plain figures that left no room for confusion or convenient oversight on anybody's part. He didn't accuse Pierce outright of dishonesty in the letter. Alara advised against it, arguing that a man cornered with a direct accusation had less reason to back down quietly than a man given a clean way to save face. But the numbers spoke plainly enough on their own, 402 head against the bank's outdated 389. The 11 steers listed with their full current weight and value. The math laid out so clearly that no honest assessor could argue with it. You think they'll let it go? Garrick asked, sealing the letter with wax and setting it aside for Cal to carry into town in the morning. I think a bank that got caught trying to rush a man into panic 3 months early isn't eager to have that story spread around Cheyenne, Alara said. Bankers depend on folks trusting them to deal fair. Word of something like today getting around wouldn't serve them well, not with other ranchers in the territory carrying loans of their own. I'd guess they'll quietly accept the corrected numbers and wait for September like the original terms said. She turned out to be right, mostly. A reply came back within 2 weeks, dry and formal, acknowledging the corrected figures and confirming the original September deadline without further comment on Pierce's early visit or his conveniently outdated assessment. Garrick read it over twice at the supper table, then set it down with something that might have been the first easy laugh Alara had heard out of him since she'd arrived. "Well," he said, "I suppose that's as close to an apology as a bank's ever like to offer." "More than I expected, honestly," Alara said. "I figured they'd find some other angle to press, given how thoroughly Pierce got caught out." "Maybe they will yet, come September," Garrick said, though there wasn't much real worry in it now, more the habit of caution than genuine fear. "But for now, I'd say we've bought ourselves a real summer to work with, instead of one spent bracing for the worst at every turn." That summer turned out to be one neither of them would forget, though neither said so out loud at the time, too caught up in the ordinary business of living it to step back and name what was happening between them. Dipfish. The ranch flourished in ways that went beyond just the cattle. The garden Alara had coaxed back from weeds came in thick through June, the peas climbing their stakes, the carrots and onions filling out steady rows, the squash she'd doubted finally sprawling out across the far corner of the plot with more vigor than she'd ever expected from seed planted so late in the season. She put up preserves through the height of summer, jars of pickled beans lining the pantry shelves, peach preserves from a trade she'd worked out with a neighboring orchard family 3 miles east. The kitchen filled most afternoons with the sweet vinegar smell of canning that Alara had always found, even back in her own struggling household, to be one of the most satisfying smells in the world. The hens multiplied past what Garrick had traded for, and by midsummer there were enough eggs that Alara started selling the surplus into town through the general store. The extra coin going into a jar she kept on the kitchen shelf, modest but growing, a small private cushion she'd started building without quite admitting to herself why it mattered so much to have something set aside that was entirely her own. The ranch hands, too, had settled into something easier than the careful, worn-thin men she'd first met on the road that cold morning in early spring. Cal had stopped talking about the railroad work entirely, throwing himself instead into learning more of the breeding and herd management side of ranching, peppering Garrick with questions most evenings that Garrick, to Alara's quiet satisfaction, seemed to genuinely enjoy answering, the two of them falling into something like the easy rapport of an older brother teaching a younger one the family trade. Otis kept telling his increasingly improbable stories, though Bertie had taken to fact-checking him with such regularity that Otis had started embellishing further just to keep the game interesting, the whole table dissolving into laughter most evenings over some new outrageous claim about Otis's supposed exploits in Missouri. And Bertie himself had changed the most visibly of all three, in Alara's eyes. The careful, guarded quiet he'd carried that first week had softened into something easier, not gone entirely. He was still a man who measured his words before spending them, but warmer now, more willing to offer a comment or a small joke at the table, more willing to linger in the kitchen doorway, some evenings just to talk, the way he had that day by the wash line. "You've done something to this place none of us could manage on our own," he told her one evening in July, leaning against the kitchen door frame while she finished the last of the dishes, the others already out to the bunkhouse for the night. "I don't know if you understand the shape of it, coming in fresh the way you did. But this ranch was dying slow before you got here. Not the cattle, the rest of it. The part that makes a place worth staying at, instead of just a place a man works because he doesn't know what else to do with himself." "I think I understand it better than you'd guess," Alara said, drying her hands. "I lived in a house like that myself, the last year or so with Thomas. A place can die around people who are still living in it if nobody tends to the parts that matter." "You tend to things well," Bertie said, simple and direct in the way he rarely managed except when something mattered enough to push past his usual caution. "My brother would have liked you. He had a way of noticing things too, the small stuff other folks walked right past. Garrick's lucky you came down that road when you did." He left before she could find a proper response to that, and Alara stood alone in the kitchen a long moment, something warm and unsteady settling in her chest, the particular ache of being seen clearly by people who'd had every reason, given the circumstances of her arrival, to overlook her entirely. It was in early August that the first real test of what had been quietly building between Alara and Garrick arrived, not from the bank this time, but from town. Cal came back from a supply run with more than just the usual flour and coffee. He came back with gossip, the kind that traveled fast through a place as small and close-knit as the settlement nearest the ranch. And he delivered it at the supper table with the particular relish of a young man who hadn't yet learned that some news was better left undelivered. "Folks in town are talking about you two," he said, around a mouthful of stew, oblivious to the way Otis's eyebrows shot up in warning across the table. "Mrs. Pruitt at the general store asked me straight out if it was true Garrick had taken up with his cook. Asked it just like that, like it was the most natural question in the world." The table went quiet. Alara felt her face heat. Not from embarrassment exactly, but from something more complicated. An awareness, suddenly sharpened, of how the arrangement between her and Garrick must look from outside the easy, ordinary rhythm they'd built together over the past months. A widow, alone, living under a bachelor rancher's roof for going on 5 months now, however honest the work and the distance kept between them. "And what did you tell her?" Garrick asked, his voice carefully even, though Alara caught the tension in his jaw. "I told her Mrs. Whitlock's our cook and a fine one, and that folks ought to mind their own business," Cal said, with more dignity than his usual easy chatter suggested he possessed. "But she didn't seem to believe me much. Said it was awful convenient, a young widow ending up in a widower's kitchen, and wondered out loud when there'd be a wedding to talk about." "That's enough, Cal," Garrick said, sharper now. And Cal subsided, looking abashed, clearly only now understanding that the gossip he'd delivered with such careless enthusiasm had landed somewhere more sensitive than he'd intended. After supper, when the hands had gone and the kitchen had emptied out into its usual evening quiet, Alara found Garrick standing on the porch, looking out at the darkening hills with his arms crossed, something heavy in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there at supper. "I'm sorry," he said, before she'd even fully stepped out onto the porch beside him. "Town gossip's an ugly thing, and you didn't ask to have your name dragged through it just for doing honest work." "It's not the first time I've had folks talk about my circumstances," Alara said, leaning against the porch rail beside him, looking out at the same darkening hills. "Doesn't sting the way it might have once. Mostly it just tires me. The way people find it so easy to make assumptions about a woman's situation without bothering to ask her directly what the truth of it actually is." "What is the truth of it?" Garrick asked, quiet, not quite looking at her, and something in the careful way he asked the question told Alara this wasn't entirely about defending her reputation to nosy townsfolk anymore. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things that mattered, watching the last light fade gold and then gray over the western hills. "The truth is, I came to this ranch starving and desperate, with nothing left to lose, and you gave me honest work and a fair wage and treated me with more respect than my own husband managed in the better years of our marriage. The truth is, I've watched this place come back to life these past 5 months, and I've been glad, every single day, to be part of why. And the truth is," she paused, something in her chest tightening at the words she was about to say out loud for the first time, "I've come to care for this place, and for the people in it, more than I expected to when I climbed up behind you on that horse back in April." Garrick turned to look at her now, fully, something raw and unguarded moving across his weathered face in the fading light. "Alara." "I'm not finished," she said, though her voice had gone a little unsteady. "I know what the town's saying isn't entirely wrong, even if the way they're saying it is unkind. I have come to feel something for you, Garrick, that goes beyond what a cook ought to feel for the man who employs her. I've tried not to let it get ahead of itself, because I didn't want to presume on a kindness you offered me out of simple decency, not expecting anything more from it. But I won't sit here and pretend the gossip's entirely baseless just to spare either of us the discomfort of saying so plain." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alara's heart had time to sink considerably, wondering if she'd misjudged everything, if the careful warmth she'd felt building between them these past months had been entirely one-sided after all, a foolish hope born out of gratitude and loneliness rather than anything real. But then Garrick reached out, slow and careful, and took her hand in his rough, work-worn fingers closing gentle around hers in a way that made her breath catch. "I felt it too," he said, his voice low and rough with something he'd clearly been holding back for longer than tonight. "Longer than I've let myself admit, even to myself. I told myself it wasn't right, getting attached to a woman I'd hired out of pity on a roadside, that it wasn't fair to put that kind of weight on an arrangement that started out of her desperation and my need for a cook. I didn't want you to feel obligated to return something you didn't actually feel, just because you were dependent on this place for your living. I'm not obligated, Alara said. I've never felt obligated, Garrick. What I feel because it's true, not because I owe you anything for it. He looked at her a long moment in the deepening dark, the first stars starting to prick out over the eastern hills, and something settled in his expression that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, entirely unguarded. It's not the right time, he said, though his hand didn't let go of hers. Not with the bank business still hanging over us, not with September still ahead and everything that might come with it. I won't ask you to tie yourself to a man who might lose his land in a month's time, Alara. That wouldn't be fair to you after everything you've already lost once before. That's not your decision to make alone, Alara said, though something in her chest warmed at the careful, protective instinct behind his hesitation. But I understand the caution. We've got September to get through first. Let's see this through properly before either of us makes promises we might not be able to keep. All right, Garrick said, and though there was a visible reluctance in him, he nodded, accepting the wisdom of waiting even as everything else in his bearing suggested he'd rather not. September, then. We'll see this through, and then… He paused, something almost shy moving across his weathered face, an expression so unlike his usual careful composure that it made Alara's heart ache fondly at the sight of it. Then maybe we'll talk again, about what comes after. Maybe, Alara agreed, though the word carried more warmth than its plain sense suggested, and they stood together on the porch a while longer, his hand still wrapped around hers, watching the stars come out fully over the valley, neither of them in any hurry to break the quiet comfort of the moment. September arrived with the particular tension that comes from watching a long-feared deadline finally close in, and the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath through the final weeks of summer as Garrick prepared the herd for market, driving the cattle in sections to the railhead at Cheyenne with Otis, Cal, and Bertie all riding alongside him, while Alara stayed back at the ranch managing the house and worrying, despite her own best efforts at calm, about numbers that had once seemed so certain in the lamplit kitchen, but now felt fragile against the real test of an actual market day. The first reports came back encouraging. Prices had ticked up slightly from their worst point in the spring, not the full recovery Garrick had hoped for, but enough, combined with the recounted herd and the unexpected value of the 11 fattened steers, to bring the total close enough to the debt that the final shortfall, when Garrick rode back into the yard near the end of the first week of September, dusty and exhausted, but with something like real relief written across his weathered face, came to less than $50. $50, he said, swinging down off his horse in the yard, Alara already hurrying out from the kitchen at the sound of hooves. We're $50 short, Alara, after everything. Her heart sank for a moment, fearing the worst despite how close they'd come. But then she saw the look on his face. Not despair, but something closer to disbelief tinged with real hope, and understood there was more to the story than the bare number suggested. $50 short of what exactly? She asked. Of the full $1,300 owed, with interest, Garrick said. But I've got the egg money you've been setting aside, and Otis offered up some of his own savings without me even asking, said he wasn't going to watch this ranch go under for the sake of $50 measly after everything we'd all put into saving it. Between that and what I've got left from the herd sale, we'll cover it. We'll cover it with a little to spare even, once everything's tallied. Alara felt something break loose in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying until it released all at once. And before she quite knew what she was doing, she'd crossed the yard and thrown her arms around Garrick's neck, the dust of his long ride and the smell of horse and trail sweat clinging to him entirely forgotten in the relief of the moment. He caught her, surprised but not unwilling, his arms coming around her solid and sure, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the yard, holding on to each other with the particular fierce relief of two people who'd spent months bracing for a loss that, against every fear, hadn't come to pass after all. We did it, Alara said into his shoulder, her voice thick with something between laughter and tears. Garrick, we actually did it. You did it, he said, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, his hands still resting on her shoulders, something warm and unguarded in his weathered face. I'd have lost this ranch in May if you hadn't gotten down off that horse and started counting things nobody else thought to count. Pierce would have rushed me into panic. I'd have sold off stock too cheap trying to scramble together what I thought I owed, and none of it would have mattered. because I'd have been working off numbers that were never the full truth to begin with. We did it together, Alara said firmly. Don't go giving me all the credit, Garrick Hale. You're the one who spent 8 years building this place up from nothing, who knew this land and this herd well enough that all I had to do was point out what you'd missed in your tiredness. I just had the advantage of fresh eyes and an empty stomach that taught me not to waste anything. He laughed at that, a real laugh, full and unguarded in a way she'd rarely heard from him, and the sound of it settled something warm and certain in her chest that felt, in that moment, like the surest thing she'd known in longer than she could remember. The final payment went through within the week, the bank's confirmation arriving with considerably more warmth in its formal language than the earlier exchanges had carried, and Garrick read it out at the supper table to a chorus of whoops from Cal and Otis, Bertie's quiet, satisfied smile, and Alara's own tears, which she wiped away quickly, embarrassed but unable to fully stop them, the relief of months finally given somewhere to land. To Mrs. Whitlock, Otis announced, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, the finest cook, the sharpest mind, and the bravest woman to ever stare down a banker on this side of the territory. Hear, hear, Cal echoed, raising his own cup, and even Bertie lifted his in quiet agreement, and Garrick watched the whole scene with an expression that Alara would carry with her long after that particular evening had faded into memory. Pride and gratitude, and something deeper and steadier underneath both of those things, something that had been building all summer, and now, with the weight of the debt finally lifted, had room enough to breathe and grow into whatever it was meant to become. Autumn settled over the valley slow and golden, the hills turning amber and rust, the air carrying that particular sharpness that promised winter wasn't far behind it. The ranch hummed along in the easy rhythm of harvest season, Alara's garden giving up its last yields before the first hard frost, the canning shelves in the pantry now lined thick with jars of preserved vegetables and fruit that would carry the household comfortably through the cold months ahead. Garrick and Alara had settled in the weeks since the debt was cleared into something that neither of them named outright, but that had become unmistakable to everyone on the ranch regardless. Evenings spent together on the porch after supper, his hand finding hers in the quiet dark, conversations that ran longer and easier than the practical business of the ranch strictly required, a warmth between them that the hands had all noticed and, with varying degrees of subtlety, approved of entirely. You two gonna make it official before winter, or are you planning to keep courting at this pace till next spring? Otis asked one October evening, with the particular bluntness of an old man who'd earned the right to ask whatever he pleased. Mind your business, Otis, Garrick said, though there was no real heat in it, just the easy embarrassment of a man caught out in something he hadn't yet found the courage to act on properly. I am minding my business, Otis said. My business is this ranch, and this ranch runs a great deal better with Mrs. Whitlock in charge of the kitchen, and I'd hate to see some other rancher get the sense to ask her proper before you work up the nerve. There's no other rancher courting Mrs. Whitlock, Garrick said, an edge of real warning in his voice now. Not yet, Otis said cheerfully, entirely unbothered. But a woman like that doesn't stay unmarried forever, Garrick. Not in a territory as short on decent women as this one. I'm just saying, if you've got intentions, might be wise not to sit on them too long. Alara, who'd overheard the exchange from the kitchen doorway, felt her face heat, but she caught Garrick's eye across the yard and something passed between them. Embarrassment, yes, but underneath it something steadier, an acknowledgement that Otis, however blunt, wasn't entirely wrong about the shape of things. The proper conversation, when it finally came, arrived not with any great ceremony, but in the quiet, ordinary way that most of the truly important moments between them had unfolded. On a cold morning in early November, the first real snow of the season falling soft and steady outside the kitchen window while Alara stood at the stove, watching the flakes settle thick and white over the yard, the garden plot now bare and waiting for spring. The hills beyond gone gray-white under the season's first proper covering. Garrick came in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots, and stood a moment in the doorway watching her at the stove before he spoke. First snow, he said. It is, Alara agreed, not turning from the pot she was stirring. Came earlier than I expected. Margaret used to say first snow was good luck, if you caught it falling and made a wish before the ground was fully covered. Garrick's voice had gone quieter, more careful, and Alara turned from the stove now, sensing something building in him that went beyond casual conversation about weather. "Did you make one?" she asked. "A wish, I mean." "Already got everything I'd have wished for," Garrick said, and the directness of it, so unlike his usual careful hesitation, made Alara's breath catch. "That's sort of what I came in here to talk about, if you'll let me get the words out before I lose my nerve entirely." Alara set down her spoon, giving him her full attention, something in her chest going very still and very alert. "I've been turning this over since September," Garrick said, twisting his hat in his hands, the old nervous habit she'd come to recognize from that very first day on the road. "Since before that, if I'm honest with myself. I told you back in August it wasn't the right time, with the bank business hanging over us, and that was true enough then. But the bank business is settled now, has been for 2 months, and I find I've run clean out of good reasons to keep waiting." "Waiting for what?" Alara asked, though something in her chest already suspected the answer, hope building so fast and fierce it nearly stole her breath. "I'm not going to ask you to stay on as my cook," Garrick said. "You've been more than that to this ranch for months now, and we both know it, and it'd be a fool's errand pretending otherwise just to keep things simple." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife, Alara. Not because I need a cook, and not out of any kind of obligation either of us owes the other for what's passed between us this year. I'm asking because I've come to love you, plain and simple, in a way I didn't expect to feel again after Margaret, and because this ranch, this whole life I've been holding together by stubbornness more than anything else, doesn't feel like a place worth holding on to unless you're standing in it beside me, as my equal partner in every sense of the word, not just my employee." Alara felt tears prick hot and sudden behind her eyes, and she didn't bother trying to hide them, didn't bother with the careful composure she'd held on to through 6 weeks of starvation and months of hard, uncertain work. "I've been waiting for you to say something near to that since August," she said, her voice thick. "I told myself I wouldn't push you toward it, that you needed your own time to find the courage, especially after what you lost before. But I'll admit, Garrick Hale, you took your sweet time getting there." He laughed, startled and relieved all at once, crossing the kitchen in 3 quick steps to pull her into his arms, and Alara went willingly, burying her face against his shoulder, the smell of snow and wood smoke and horse clinging to his coat in a way that had become, over these past months, more familiar and dear to her than almost anything else in her life. "Is that a yes, then?" he asked, his voice rough against her hair. "It's a yes," Alara said, pulling back just enough to look up at him properly, her face wet but her smile fierce and certain. "It's the easiest yes I've ever given anybody, Garrick. Easier than the yes I gave you on that road back in April, and that one changed my whole life." "This one's going to change it more," Garrick said, smiling down at her with an openness she'd rarely seen on his weathered face, the careful guard he usually carried fully set aside for once. "I'm counting on it," Alara said, and pulled him down to kiss her, soft and certain, while outside the kitchen window the season's first snow kept falling steady and quiet over the valley, settling thick and white over the bare garden plot, the sleeping fields, the whole wide stretch of land that had nearly slipped away from them both before stubborn hope and careful counting had pulled it back from the edge. The wedding, when it came together 2 weeks later, was a simple affair, exactly the kind that suited 2 practical people who'd built their understanding of each other through hard work and honest trouble rather than grand romantic gestures. They married in the front room of the ranch house, the same room where Margaret's portrait still sat on its shelf, dusted carefully and undisturbed, because Alara had insisted on that point plainly when Garrick had hesitantly raised whether it ought to be moved. "She's part of this house's history," Alara had said, "and part of yours. I'm not interested in erasing what came before me, Garrick. I'm only interested in building what comes next, alongside it." The circuit preacher who served the territory happened to be passing through that week, which Otis declared Providence plain and simple, though Alara privately suspected it had more to do with Cal's quietly arranged invitation than any particular stroke of fortune. The ceremony itself was brief, the words simple and direct, and the small, gathered crowd, Otis, Cal, Bertie, a handful of neighboring ranch families who'd come to know and respect Alara's cooking and her steady hand with the household over the past months, filled the front room with a warmth that the house, Alara reflected, watching it all unfold, had been sorely missing for far too long before she'd ever arrived. Afterward, there was a meal Alara had spent 2 full days preparing, despite Garrick's protests that she ought to let someone else handle the cooking on her own wedding day, and a kind of easy, rowdy celebration that ran late into the cold November evening, Otis telling his tallest tale yet about wrestling not one, but two bears simultaneously. The whole table dissolving into laughter that Bertie's dry correction only made funnier. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Garrick and Alara stood together on the porch, wrapped against the cold, looking out at the snow-covered hills under a clear, star-thick sky. "Quite a year," Garrick said, his arms settled comfortable around her shoulders. "Quite a year," Alara agreed, leaning into him, feeling the steady warmth of him against the cold night air. "I came down that road in April with nothing left to my name but a few dollars and a stomach full of bitter berries. I didn't expect any of this, Garrick, not the ranch, not the danger we faced together, and certainly not you." "I didn't expect it either," he said. "I'd given up on expecting much of anything good, the years after Margaret. Just kept the cattle fed and the days moving forward because I didn't know what else to do with myself." He pulled her a little closer against the cold. "Then a stubborn, half-starved woman climbed up behind me on a roadside and turned everything I thought I understood about my own life inside out." "For the better, I hope," Alara said, smiling against the cold air. "For the better," Garrick confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Without question, for the better." They stood together a while longer on the porch, watching the snow settle thick and silent over the valley that had so nearly slipped away from them both. The house behind them warm with the lingering glow of the evening's celebration. The future ahead of them uncertain in the way all futures were, but faced now, for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit, with two people standing together instead of one person carrying the weight alone. 5 years had a way of folding into themselves when a person tried to look back on them all at once, the hard months blurring together with the good ones until what remained was less a clear timeline and more a feeling, a weight and texture to the years that Alara Hale carried in her chest the way she carried most things now. Settled, certain, hard-won. She stood at the kitchen window on a September morning with flowers still dusting her forearms, watching her son chase one of the barn cats across the yard with the single-minded fury that only a 4-year-old could bring to such an utterly pointless pursuit, and she let herself, just for a moment, stop kneading the bread dough and simply watch him. Thomas Otis Hale, named half for the husband she'd buried in a hard winter 5 years back, and half for the old hand who'd offered up his own savings without being asked, the two names sitting together in a way that had felt right to both her and Garrick when they'd chosen them, an honoring of the past without being chained to its grief, had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin, and he ran now across the yard with the kind of reckless joy that told Alara, every time she watched him, exactly how different this house was from the one she'd walked into 5 Aprils ago. "He's never going to catch that cat," Garrick said, coming up behind her, his hand settling warm at the small of her back as he looked out the same window. "Cat's faster than he is by a country mile." "He doesn't care about catching it," Alara said, smiling. "He just likes the running. Wonder where he gets that from." Garrick's voice carried the particular dry warmth she'd come to know so well over the years, the kind of teasing that had taken him months to find comfortable back when she'd first arrived. A man so unused to lightness that every joke had once come out of him like it cost him something. It didn't cost him anything anymore. That perhaps was one of the quieter victories of these 5 years. Not the ranch, not the money, but the simple fact that her husband laughed easily now, that the careful, grief-worn man she'd met on a roadside had grown back into someone who found joy unremarkable instead of foreign. "I imagine he gets it from a father who used to gallop a horse 11 miles just to ask a starving woman if she could cook," Alara said, turning from the window to look at him properly. "That's not exactly a man known for patience and stillness." "I was patient," Garrick protested. "I waited a whole August before I said anything about how I felt." "You waited because you were terrified, not because you were patient," Alara said, laughing now, and he laughed too, pulling her into a brief, easy embrace that had become as natural to both of them as breathing, the kind of closeness that didn't need grand declarations anymore because it had been proven, day after ordinary day, for 5 years running. The ranch itself bore little resemblance to the neglected, dust-choked place Garrick had first led her to on that cold April morning. Where there had once been 400 head of cattle counted carefully and conservatively against a debt that threatened to swallow everything, There now ran closer to 900. The herd built up steady and smart over the years through careful breeding decisions that Garrick made with an increasing confidence. Decisions he'd taken to discussing with Alara at the kitchen table most evenings, the same way they'd once pored over the desperate arithmetic of survival. The kitchen garden had grown too, expanded twice over the years until it supplied not just the ranch house, but a regular surplus that Alara sold through the general store alongside her eggs, a small but steady trade that had, over time, become enough that she kept her own separate account at the Cheyenne Bank. Not Pierce's bank, she'd made sure of that, choosing instead a smaller establishment in town whose manager, a quiet, fair-dealing man named Whitfield, had earned her trust through years of honest dealing rather than convenient paperwork. Pierce himself had been let go from his position at the original bank 2 years back, a fact Otis had delivered to the supper table with undisguised satisfaction, having heard it secondhand from a rancher 2 valleys over who'd had his own trouble with the man's particular brand of convenient accounting. Nobody at the table had shed any tears over the news. The hands had grown and changed too, in their own ways. Cal, now well into his 20s, had taken on something close to a foreman's role, his early enthusiasm for learning the breeding side of ranching having matured into real expertise that Garrick relied on more every season. He'd married a young woman from town the previous spring, a quiet, sharp-eyed seamstress named Ruth who'd taken an immediate liking to Alara. The two of them often found together on Sunday afternoons, trading recipes and patterns, with the easy comfort of women who recognized a kindred practical mind in each other. Otis had slowed some, the years and the old limp catching up with him in ways he grumbled about constantly, but never let stop him from a full day's work. And he'd taken to a kind of unofficial grandfather role with young Thomas, the boy following the old man around the barn most afternoons, listening to stories that had grown, if anything, even taller with the passing years. Bertie remained quieter than the others, but he'd settled into the ranch with a permanence that spoke to how thoroughly he'd come to think of it as home rather than just a place of work. He'd taken, in recent years, to keeping bees along the south fence line, an interest that had started almost by accident and grown into a genuine passion, and the honey he harvested each fall had become as much a fixture of the Hale household's pantry as Alara's preserves. "Your brother would be glad to see this place," Alara told him once, watching him work carefully among the hives in his protective gear, moving with a gentle confidence that seemed at odds with the rough cowboy work he still did the rest of his hours. "I think he'd recognize something of himself in how careful you are with those bees." Bertie had gone quiet a moment, the way he still did when something touched a tender place in him, and then nodded slowly. "I think so too," he said. "Funny thing, grief. You think it's going to swallow you whole forever, and then one day you look up and find you've built something good right alongside it, without the grief ever fully going away. Just makes room for the good, somehow, instead of crowding it out." It was, Alara thought often in the years that followed, one of the truest things anybody had ever said to her about the particular shape of loss and recovery, and she carried it with her the way she carried most hard-won wisdom, quietly but close. The crisis with the bank had become, over the years, something closer to legend than memory, a story told and retold at the supper table on slow winter evenings, each telling adding its own small embellishments the way all good stories did with enough years of retelling behind them. Young Thomas, even at 4, had already heard the story enough times that he could recite the basic shape of it himself, though his version tended to feature his mother single-handedly wrestling a banker to the ground, a detail that made Otis laugh so hard he had to leave the table the first time Thomas told it back to him with complete earnest conviction. "That's not quite how it happened," Alara told her son one evening, tucking him into bed while Garrick lingered in the doorway, watching with the same soft, unguarded expression he still wore most evenings when he looked at the two of them together. "I didn't wrestle anybody, Thomas. I just counted things carefully and told the truth plainly, and that turned out to be enough." "But you saved the ranch," Thomas said, with the absolute certainty of a small child repeating something he'd been told many times and had no reason to doubt. "Your mother and I saved it together," Garrick said, coming further into the room, settling on the edge of the bed beside his son. "That's the real truth of it, Thomas, and it's a better truth than any wrestling match, even if it doesn't sound quite as exciting. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting with their fists. It's looking hard at a problem nobody else wants to look at, and telling the truth about what you find, even when the truth is inconvenient for somebody powerful. Thomas considered this with the serious deliberation small children sometimes brought to ideas too big for them, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Is that why you married Mama? Because she told the truth?" Garrick glanced up at Alara, something warm and amused passing between them over their son's head. "Partly," he said. "I married your mother because she was the bravest, smartest, most stubborn woman I'd ever met, and because she made this house feel like a home again after I'd gone a long while forgetting what that even felt like. The truth-telling was just one part of all that, though it was an important part. I'm glad she found you on the road," Thomas said, already drowsy, his eyes drifting shut. "What if she hadn't been there? What if you'd just ridden past?" It was a question that had occurred to Alara more than once over the years. In the quiet hours of the night when sleep didn't come easy, the particular vertigo of imagining a life that had so nearly not happened at all. If she'd chosen a different road that morning, if Garrick had ridden past without stopping, if either of them had made one different small choice in the chain of small choices that had led them here, to this room, this child, this whole built and rebuilt life. "I think about that sometimes too," Garrick said, his voice gone soft and thoughtful in the dim lamplight. "But I don't think it would have gone different, Thomas. I think some things find their way to happening, one road or another. Your mother was too stubborn and too strong to stay lost on a roadside forever. And I'd like to think I wasn't quite so far gone in my own grief that I'd have rode past a woman in trouble forever, no matter what road I happened to be on that particular morning." Thomas was asleep before Garrick finished speaking, his small chest rising and falling steady in the lamplight, and Alara and Garrick sat together a while longer in the quiet of their son's room, neither in any hurry to break the peaceful stillness of the moment. "Do you ever think about it?" Garrick asked later, once they'd retired to their own room. The house gone quiet around them, the late September wind picking up soft against the windows. "What might have happened if things had gone different that morning?" "Sometimes," Alara admitted. "Mostly, I try not to dwell on it. What's the use picking at a road not taken when the one we did take turned out so well? But I won't lie and say it never crosses my mind, especially on hard days, the particular thinness of how close we both came to losing everything, more than once." "We didn't, though," Garrick said, pulling her close against him in the dark. "That's the part worth remembering, I think. Not how close the danger came, but how we managed to meet it anyway, every time, together, instead of alone." "That's the part I try to remember too," Alara said, settling into the familiar warmth of him, the particular comfort of 5 years' worth of nights spent exactly like this one. "Though I'll admit, some days it's easier than others." The ranch's prosperity had become, over the years, something the whole territory had taken notice of. The hail spread now spoken of with the kind of respect that had once belonged to the larger, longer-established operations in the valley. A remarkable turnaround that more than a few of the neighboring ranchers had asked Garrick about directly, hoping to learn whatever particular trick had pulled his outfit back from the edge of ruin into genuine prosperity. "There's no trick to it," Garrick told one such curious neighbor, a rancher named Holloway, who'd ridden over one autumn afternoon specifically to ask about it, sitting now at the Hale kitchen table with a cup of Alara's coffee in hand. "Just paid closer attention to what I already had, instead of always bracing for the worst before I'd even properly counted what was real. My wife taught me that mostly. I'd gotten so used to expecting loss after my first wife passed that I stopped looking clearly at my own numbers, my own herd, my own life, really. Took a stranger with fresh eyes to show me I'd been undervaluing what I actually had all along." "Fresh eyes?" Holloway repeated, looking thoughtfully toward where Alara stood at the stove, half listening while she worked. "That a particular skill of yours, Mrs. Hale?" "I think it's mostly just a willingness to look at hard numbers honestly, instead of flinching away from them out of fear," Alara said, turning from the stove. "Fear makes people careless in a particular way, Mr. Holloway. It makes a person brace so hard for the worst outcome that they stop seeing the actual shape of what's in front of them. I've found in my own life that the clearest way through trouble is usually just looking at it square, counting what's real instead of what you're afraid might be real, and going from there." Holloway left that afternoon with considerably more to think about than he'd arrived with, and word of the conversation spread, as such things did in a territory as close-knit as theirs, until Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, becoming something of an informal advisor to other ranching families working through their own hard seasons. Not officially, not for pay, just the quiet, steady reputation of a woman who could look at a set of troubled books and find the truth hiding in them. The same skill that had once saved her own household from ruin too late to matter, now put to use saving others before it was too late for them. "You've built quite a reputation for yourself," Garrick told her one evening. Watching her pack up a basket of preserves to take to a neighboring family, she'd promised to help look over their accounts the following week. The widow who beat the bank at its own game. "I hear Mrs. Pruitt at the general store tells the story to every new family that moves into the territory. Mrs. Pruitt's the same woman who once asked Cal straight out if I'd taken up with you improperly," Alara said dryly. "I suppose it's something, watching her gossip turn from scandal to admiration over the years." "People's opinions have a way of catching up to the truth eventually," Garrick said, "so long as you give them enough time and enough proof to work with." It was on a clear October afternoon, the hills gone gold and amber with the seasons turning, that Alara and Garrick rode out together to the eastern boundary of the ranch, a section of land Garrick had purchased the previous year, expanding the spread considerably beyond what it had been even in its best years before the trouble with the bank. Young Thomas rode between them on his own small pony, a gift from Otis the previous spring that the boy had taken to with the same reckless enthusiasm he brought to chasing barn cats. They stopped at a rise that looked back over the whole valley, the ranch house small and distant below them, smoke curling steady from its chimney. The cattle scattered dark across the golden grass in numbers that would have seemed impossible to the desperate, grieving man Garrick had been 5 years earlier. "This is close to where I first saw you," Garrick said, reining his horse in beside Alara's, looking down at the road that wound below them, the same Cheyenne road where a starving woman had once knelt picking berries off a dying bush. "Not the exact spot, but close enough. I think about that morning more than I let on, most years." "What do you think about?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew, the same way she suspected he already knew most of what passed through her own mind on quiet mornings like this one. "How close it all came to not happening," Garrick said. "Not just you and me, though that's part of it. But everything that came after, Thomas, the ranch the way it is now, Cal and Ruth, Bertie and his bees, all of it. One bad decision, one road not taken, and none of this would exist at all. It's a strange thing, building a whole life on top of a moment that could have gone so easily a different way." "I think most lives are built that way if you look at them close enough," Alara said. "Most of what matters comes down to small choices that didn't feel particularly large at the time they were made. You didn't ride up that morning thinking you were about to change the whole shape of your life. You were just a tired man who needed a cook and happened to notice a woman in trouble. I didn't say yes that morning thinking I was about to find a husband and a family and a whole new life worth living. I just said yes because I was hungry and out of better options." "And look what came of it," Garrick said, his voice rough with something that went beyond simple sentiment. "Look what came of it," Alara agreed, looking down at the ranch spread out gold and prosperous below them, at the cattle grazing peaceful across land that had so nearly slipped away from them both. At the house where her son had been born, and where 5 years of hard, honest work had built something that hadn't existed before. Not just wealth, though there was that too now, more security than either of them had dared hope for in the worst months of that first difficult year, but something deeper than wealth. A family built out of 2 broken, grieving people who'd found, in each other, and in the hard work of rebuilding something together, a way back to whole. "Mama?" Thomas said, pulling at her sleeve with the particular insistence of a 4-year-old who'd grown bored of adult conversation he couldn't fully follow. "Can we ride down to where you found the berries? I want to see the bush." Alara laughed, surprised by the request, and looked at Garrick, who shrugged with an indulgent smile. "I suppose we could," she said. "Though I doubt it's much to look at, Thomas. Just an ordinary chokecherry bush, same as 100 others along that road." "I want to see it anyway," Thomas insisted, with the stubborn certainty that Alara recognized with some amusement as entirely his mother's particular brand of determination, however much of his father's dark hair and quiet patience he'd also inherited. They rode down together, the 3 of them, to the spot Garrick remembered as close enough to where he'd first found her kneeling in the roadside ditch. And the bush, when they found it, was indeed unremarkable, a scraggly chokecherry, bare now in October, its berries long since dropped or eaten by birds. nothing about it suggesting the particular weight of what had once happened beside it. Thomas dismounted and walked over to examine it with the serious focus small children sometimes brought to things that mattered to them for reasons adults couldn't fully follow, running his small hand along the bare branches. "This doesn't look special," he announced, with some disappointment. "It's not special," Alara said, dismounting to stand beside him, Garrick following close behind with their pony tied to his own saddle. "That's rather the point of it, Thomas. It was just an ordinary bush on an ordinary road on what felt like the worst morning of my whole life. I wasn't looking for anything special that day. I was just trying to survive it, one small bitter berry at a time. And then Papa found you." "And then your father found me," Alara agreed, looking up at Garrick, who'd come to stand close beside them both, his hand finding hers the way it had 1,000 times over these past 5 years, familiar and certain. "And he asked me a simple question that didn't seem like much at the time, just whether I could cook for two. I said yes because I was desperate, not because I understood what that yes was about to mean for the rest of my life." "What did it mean?" Thomas asked, looking up between his two parents with the wide, earnest curiosity that had become so familiar to both of them over the years. Alara considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things her son asked her, understanding that even simple childhood questions deserved honest answers, however complicated those answers might actually be underneath their surface. "It meant everything, eventually," she said finally. "It meant a chance to build something out of nothing, when I thought I had nothing left to build with at all. It meant your father and I found each other at the exact moment we both needed finding, even though neither of us understood that at the time. It meant hard work, and real danger, and a fight to save this whole ranch from being taken away from us before we'd even had the chance to build the life we've got now. But mostly, Thomas, it meant that sometimes the worst moment in a person's life turns out to be the very beginning of the best one, if you've got the courage to keep going long enough to find out." Garrick squeezed her hand, something warm and steady passing between them over their son's head. The late afternoon sun slanting gold across the empty road. The same road that had once held nothing but desperation and shriveled berries and a woman with nowhere left to turn, now holding instead a family built whole and lasting out of that very same desperation, transformed by 5 years of honest work and hard-won trust into something neither of them could have imagined possible on that cold April morning so long ago. "I'm glad you found the bush," Garrick said, looking down at his son. "Some things are worth remembering, even when they're not particularly special to look at. Maybe especially then. The unremarkable moments turn out to matter more than the grand ones, more often than not." "Can we go home now?" Thomas asked, already losing interest in the bush itself, his attention drifting toward the horses and the prospect of the ride back. "I'm hungry." Alara laughed, the sound carrying warm and easy across the quiet road. "Of course you are. You're always hungry, same as your father was the morning he found me." "I was not eating bushes," Garrick protested, lifting Thomas back onto his pony with practiced ease. "I just needed a cook, that's all." "You needed considerably more than a cook," Alara said, mounting her own horse, "though I don't think either of us understood that yet, that particular morning." They rode back together toward the ranch house in the golden afternoon light, the smoke still curling steady from the chimney below, the cattle grazing peaceful across hills that had once seemed destined to slip away from them entirely. And Alara felt, riding alongside her husband and her son, toward the home they'd built together out of nothing more than hard work, honest counting, and a stubborn refusal to let fear decide things before they'd happened. The particular settled certainty of a woman who'd learned, the hard way, that survival and rebuilding weren't separate things at all, but two parts of the very same stubborn, ordinary courage. The courage to eat the bitter berries when there was nothing else, and the courage later to plant something better in their place and wait, patient and certain, for it to grow. The ranch house came into view below them, warm light already glowing in its windows against the gathering dusk, and somewhere behind them, the bare chokecherry bush stood unremarkable and ordinary on its lonely stretch of road, exactly as it had stood 5 years before, holding within its plain branches the quiet, unlikely beginning of everything that had come after. A debt repaid, a family built, a grief slowly transformed into something that made room for joy without ever fully erasing what had been lost along the way. And two people who'd learned together that the hardest mornings sometimes carried within them the first quiet seeds of the very best years still waiting to come.
I am Mario. Exclamation point pattern will bring it up. Very uncomplicated pattern. Okay, that's it. I really need to print this part again. Drive me bonkers. Basically, part of my my base for my yarn spinner is broke. Isn't it? It's really cute. I like it. Joe, designed by Joe. Um, he recommended it. Give me a second, y'all. And so we're gonna cancel that for now. And over here, accidentally open. Okay, the only thing is, I think, yep, it was from downloads, open projects. Mm, is this it? I'm trying to find it. No, that is not it. That is massive. Open projects. Is it this one? Maybe.